Delia Grange counted the bills one final time under the buzzing fluorescent light of the laundromat, her fingers moving with the slow precision of someone who had learned that mistakes in arithmetic cost meals. $4. 2 crumpled singles, 8 quarters, and a small pile of dimes and nickels that had been accumulating in the bottom of an old coffee can for the better part of 6 months. The coffee can itself was sitting empty on the folding table now, its painted daisies faded to ghost impressions of the cheerful pattern they had once been. $4 to her name on a Tuesday night in late March, and outside the plate glass window, the rain that had been falling for 11 straight days was still coming down in the stubborn, sideways way that rain fell in the small town of Mercer Hollow when the river was getting ready to do something it shouldn't. Her daughter Rosie was asleep in the plastic chair beside her, curled up like a cat, her cheek pressed against the strap of the old backpack that held everything that mattered to a 7-year-old girl. A stuffed fox with one missing eye, a library book about horses that was 6 days overdue, a drawing pad with the corner chewed off from when she had carried it in her teeth as a toddler, back when she had hands that were always full of something else. Rosie's breath came slow and even, and Delia watched her for a long moment, memorizing the particular angle of her daughter's eyelashes against her cheek, the way her mouth fell slightly open in sleep, the small freckle just below her left ear that Delia had kissed 1,000 times and would kiss 1,000 times more if the world would let her. The phone in Delia's jacket pocket buzzed, and she knew before she pulled it out that it would be another text from her landlord. Mr. Harvey had stopped sending polite reminders 6 weeks ago. Now his messages arrived in the clipped, bulleted format of someone who had already mentally drafted the eviction paperwork and was just waiting for the right Tuesday to file it. She read the message without really reading it. Something about Friday. Something about the sheriff. Something about how she had been warned and warned and warned, and there was only so much patience a man could be expected to have when he had his own bills to pay. She slid the phone back into her pocket and looked down at the $4 on the folding table. The laundromat owner, a tired woman named Beverly who had been kind to Delia in small, unspoken ways for almost 2 years, was wiping down the counter and pretending not to notice the math happening in the corner. Beverly had let Delia use the dryer for free more than once, had slipped her half a sandwich at closing time, had once handed her a crumpled 20 and said only, "Don't embarrass me by trying to give it back." That 20 had fed Rosie for 3 days. Delia had never forgotten it, but she had also never been able to repay it, and the shame of that sat in her chest like a small, hot stone she could not cough up no matter how long she tried. "You closing soon, Bev?" Delia asked, because she had to ask something, because the silence was starting to feel like an accusation. 15 minutes, honey, Beverly said, without looking up from the counter. "But you take your time. No rush." There was a rush, though. There was always a rush now. Delia had been measuring her life in 15-minute increments for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to think in weeks or months or years. She had been a woman with a 5-year plan once. A woman with a savings account and a retirement account and a small, sensible life that had been built brick by a person she could no longer quite remember being. That life had burned down in the space of 11 months, and the woman who had built it had burned down with it. And what was left was this. A folding table. $4. A sleeping child. A river that was about to do something it shouldn't. The bell over the door jingled, and Delia looked up out of habit, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing, because hoping for things had become a luxury she could no longer afford. The man who came in was tall and narrow and wearing a wet canvas jacket that had seen too many winters. He nodded at Beverly, gave Delia a polite glance that did not linger, and began feeding quarters into the machine nearest the door. Delia watched him for a moment, and something in the way he moved, the economy of it, the way he did not waste a single motion, reminded her of her grandfather, dead now almost 12 years, and she felt the familiar, sudden ambush of grief that still came for her at strange moments. In laundromats and grocery store aisles and the quiet hour before dawn when she lay awake listening to Rosie breathe and thinking about everything she had lost. Her grandfather had owned a piece of land at the edge of Mercer Hollow. Just a small lot, maybe an acre-and-a-half, nothing special, sitting on the low ground down by where Copper Creek met the Mercer River. He had bought it in 1971 for $200 and had never done anything with it, because the land flooded every spring and sometimes in the fall too, and the town had written it off as useless long before Delia had been born. When he died, the lot had passed to her mother, and when her mother died 4 years later, it had passed to Delia along with a small, unremarkable collection of things that had seemed like burdens at the time. A box of old photographs, a crocheted blanket, a tin of her grandfather's fishing lures, and a deed to a flooded piece of land that nobody in Mercer Hollow would buy for more than pocket change. Delia had paid the property taxes on that lot for 6 years without ever visiting it. It had seemed important, in some way she could not quite articulate, to hold on to the one thing her grandfather had left behind. But the taxes had grown from $41 a year to $63, and then this year the county had revised its assessment, and the bill had come in at $112, and Delia had stared at the envelope on her kitchen counter for 3 days before she opened it. And when she opened it, she had cried for 40 minutes. And then she had put the bill in the drawer with the other bills she could not pay, and she had gone to work. Work. That was a word that had meant something different a year ago. Delia had been a paralegal at a small firm in the county seat, a 40-minute drive away, pulling down $46,000 a year in benefits, not rich by any measure, but steady. Steady in the way that a woman raising a daughter on her own had to be. And then Rosie had gotten sick in August. Not sick in the ordinary way that children got sick, with fevers and runny noses and a few missed days of school. Sick in the other way. The way that involves specialists and second opinions, and a word that nobody wants to hear spoken in a room with their child's name on the door. It had turned out not to be the worst version of what they had feared. A benign tumor on her thyroid, the surgeon had said, using the word benign like it was supposed to be a relief, and Delia had nodded and smiled, and signed the consent forms, and then gone out to her car in the hospital parking lot, and sat there for 2 hours not crying, just breathing, just counting her breaths the way the therapist she could no longer afford had once taught her to do. The surgery had gone well. The recovery had gone well. Rosie was fine. Rosie was going to be fine. But the bills had not been fine. The insurance had covered less than Delia had been told it would cover. The surgeon had been in network, but the anesthesiologist had been out of network, a distinction nobody had explained to her at the time. A trap she had fallen into while her daughter was being wheeled down a hallway under fluorescent lights. The follow-up appointments had not all been covered. The medications had not all been covered. By the time the dust settled, Delia owed $19,000 that she did not have, and the collection agencies had started calling in October, and by December, she had missed her first rent payment, and by January the firm had let her go. They had called it a restructuring. They had been kind about it. The kindness had not paid the rent. The man near the door fed another quarter into the machine, and Delia looked away, back at her own $4, back at her sleeping daughter, back at the ring. Her phone buzzed again. She did not look at it. At 9 o'clock, Beverly said, soft as she could, "Honey, I hate to do this, but I've got to close up." Delia nodded. She gathered Rosie up, the girl heavier than she had any right to be for a child so thin, and she slung the backpack over her own shoulder, and she walked out into the rain. Her car was in the parking lot, a 2004 Corolla with a crack in the windshield and a transmission that made a grinding noise when it got cold, but which had not yet entirely betrayed her. She buckled Rosie into the back seat, tucking the jacket around her, and then she sat behind the wheel for a moment with the engine off, listening to the rain on the roof, and she did not know where to go. The motel on Route 9 wanted $48 for a room. She had 4. The shelter in the county seat was 40 minutes away, and she did not have the gas. Her mother's cousin Rita, who had put them up for 3 nights in February before her husband had put a stop to it, was not an option. There was no one left to call. There was no one left who had not already been called. She thought, then, of the lot. It was a foolish thought. The lot was underwater half the time. There was nothing on it. A rusted-out shed, maybe, if it was still standing. No house. No well. No power. Just a piece of swampy, useless land at the end of a gravel road that nobody drove down except kids looking for a place to drink beer. But it was hers. And it was dry ground above the gravel. And it was free. She drove. She drove through the empty streets of Mercer Hollow, past the darkened storefronts on Main, past the church where she had gone twice as a girl with her grandfather and never since, past the high school where she had graduated 16 years ago with a 3.8 GPA and a head full of plans. She drove with the wipers going as fast as they would go, which was not fast enough, and she drove with one hand on the wheel, and the other pressed flat against the dashboard like she was bracing for something, although she did not know what. The gravel road was worse than she remembered. The Corolla bottomed out twice, and Rosie stirred in the back seat and murmured something and went back to sleep. The road ended at a sagging wire fence with a gate that had rusted open 20 years ago and had never been closed since. Beyond the gate, the land sloped gently down toward the creek, and in the dark, with the rain, Delia could see almost nothing. Just the vague shape of the old shed at the far end of the property, black against a slightly less black sky. Just the glint of standing water where there should have been grass. She killed the engine. She sat. She cried, once, hard, for about 90 seconds, with both hands pressed over her mouth so she would not wake Rosie. And then she stopped crying, because crying did not help, and because she had work to do. The shed was still standing. That was the first small mercy. It was leaning badly to the north, its tin roof pocked with rust, its door hanging by a single hinge. But the inside was dry, or dry enough. Delia swept the worst of the leaves and spiderwebs out with her hand and a stick she found outside. She spread the old picnic blanket from the trunk of the Corolla on the wooden floor. She carried Rosie in and laid her down and covered her with her own coat. She sat beside her daughter in the dark with her back against the wall of the shed, and she listened to the rain on the tin roof, and she thought, this is what we have. This is what is left. In the morning, the light came in gray and thin through the gaps in the shed wall. Rosie woke up slowly, the way she always did, blinking and confused, and when she saw where she was, she did not cry, because Rosie almost never cried anymore. She looked around the inside of the shed. She looked at her mother. She said, "Are we camping?" "Yes," Delia said, because it was easier than the truth. "We're camping for a little while. It's going to be an adventure." "Okay," Rosie said. And then, after a moment, "I have to go to the bathroom." They peed behind the shed, Delia holding up her coat for privacy, as if there was anyone for 50 miles who might be looking. Afterward, Delia stood on the little rise where the shed sat, and she looked out over the land. Her land. Her grandfather's land. The lot. In daylight, in the rain, it looked like exactly what everyone said it was. A swamp. A useless piece of floodplain. The water had pushed up past the usual bank and was standing in shallow pools across 2/3 of the acre-and-a-half. Cattails grew in clumps. A fallen cottonwood tree lay across the lower corner, half-rotted, home to God knew what. The grass was the pale, drowned color of things that had spent too long underwater. To the east, the creek was running high and brown, and beyond it, Delia could see the back fences of the neat little houses on Birch Street, where people with mortgages and jobs and intact lives were having their coffee and looking out their kitchen windows at the sad gray morning. This was not land anyone wanted. This was not land anyone had ever wanted. The county had tried to buy it from her grandfather in 1986 for $400, and he had refused, and everyone in Mercer Hollow had laughed at him for refusing, because what fool would turn down $400 for $200 worth of swamp? Her grandfather had only ever said, when the subject came up, that the land was worth more than it looked like. He had said it with a small smile, the smile he used when he knew something other people didn't, which was more often than anyone credited him for. Delia had asked him once, when she was 9 or 10, what he meant. What could possibly be worth anything about a flooded lot that nobody could build on? He had been sitting on the porch of his little house on Elm Street, cleaning a fishing reel with a rag. He had not looked up from his work. He had said, "Sometimes the ground knows things the people don't. You remember that, Delia girl. People will tell you what a place is worth based on what they can see. But the ground knows. The ground keeps its own books." She had not understood him. She had been 9. She had gone back to coloring at the kitchen table and had not thought about it for 26 years. She thought about it now, standing in the rain, watching the cattails shiver in the wind. "Mom," Rosie said, tugging at the hem of her jacket. "I'm hungry." Delia had one granola bar in her backpack. She had been saving it for an emergency, and although she was not entirely sure what this was if not an emergency, she split the bar in half and gave the larger half to Rosie and watched her daughter eat it in 3 bites and not ask for more. They drove back into town. Delia used the last of her $4 to buy a cup of coffee at the gas station, which she did not drink, but which bought her the right to sit in the warm lobby with Rosie for 40 minutes and use the bathroom and wash her face. The woman at the counter, a heavy-set woman named Marge who had been 2 years ahead of Delia in high school, watched her come in with the kind of face people made when they recognized someone they had hoped never to see again in that particular condition. Marge said nothing. She rang up the coffee. She slid a packaged muffin across the counter without a word, without meeting Delia's eyes, and then she turned her back and pretended to be busy restocking the cigarettes. Delia put the muffin in her pocket. For later. For Rosie. It was at the gas station that she ran into Harlan Pike. Harlan was her mother's second cousin, or something like that, a man in his late 60s who had been circling Delia's family for decades in the way that certain relatives circle certain families, looking for openings, looking for angles, looking for anything that might be converted into something he could use. He was not a bad man, exactly. He was just a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that other people's misfortunes were the most reliable source of his own small advantages, and he had built a life around that principle with a kind of grim consistency. He drove a tow truck. He bought things at estate sales. He knew, always, who in town was going under and how soon. "Delia," he said, when he saw her. He took off his cap in a gesture that was meant to look like respect, but was really just reconnaissance. "I heard about your situation." Everyone had heard about her situation. Mercer Hollow had 1,100 people and a telephone network that did not need phones. "I'm fine, Harlan," she said. "I'm sure you are. I'm sure you are." He nodded, looking past her at Rosie, who was eating the muffin now in careful, rationing bites. "Cute kid. She's gotten big." "Thank you." "Listen," Harlan said. And this was the moment Delia had known was coming from the second she had seen him in the doorway. "I heard Mr. Harvey's about ready to put you out on Friday. We'll be fine." "I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it for a minute." He nodded again, slowly, a man building up to the thing he had come to say. "I was thinking, though, that lot of your granddaddy's, down by the creek. That old swamp piece." Delia's jaw tightened. She did not answer. "I'd take it off your hands," Harlan said. "Give you a little something for it. Not much, you understand, on account of it's not worth much. But something. Enough to get you and the girl set up somewhere for a few weeks. Help you get back on your feet." "How much?" Harlan made a show of thinking about it, rubbing his chin, looking at the ceiling, performing the theater of the considered offer. "I was thinking $400. For the piece of land her grandfather had refused $400 for in 1986, almost 40 years ago, when $400 had been worth roughly 5 times what it was worth now." Delia did the math in her head, and she felt the small, hot stone of shame in her chest flare up into something else, something harder and brighter. "No," she said. "Delia, honey, think about it. That land floods every year. You can't build on it. You can't even walk on half of it in the spring. It's costing you taxes. It's going to keep costing you taxes. I'm offering you a way out." "No," she said again. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. His face did not change, exactly, but something behind his face rearranged itself. "Well," he said, "suit yourself. But you think on it, Delia. You think on it hard. Because my offer's good for about another 48 hours, and then it's not. And nobody else in this town is going to give you $4 for that lot, let alone 400. You know that." He put his cap back on. He nodded at Rosie. He walked out of the gas station and got into his tow truck and drove away. And Delia stood there with her cold coffee, and she felt Marge watching her from behind the counter, and she knew with a certainty that went all the way down to her bones that by noon, every person in Mercer Hollow would know that Harlan Pike had offered Delia Grange $400 for her worthless lot, and she had turned him down. By the time the sun was properly up, the story was everywhere. She drove back through town to pick up some things from her apartment, and she could feel it moving ahead of her, racing from window to window. At the feed and seed, old Mr. Coates came out on the porch to watch her drive by, shaking his head slowly. At the post office, 2 women she had gone to high school with were standing on the steps, and when they saw her car they turned their heads together in the particular way that meant she had become, overnight, a cautionary tale. By the time she reached her apartment, her phone had 3 voicemails from people she had not spoken to in years, each of them offering, in various tones of condescension and pity, the same basic message. "Take the 400, Delia. Just take the 400. You have a kid to think about." She packed what she could carry in 2 garbage bags and a laundry basket. She left the furniture, because the furniture had never really been hers, and she left the dishes, because she had bought them at a yard sale for $9 in total, and she was not going to haul them to a shed. She took the photograph of her mother that sat on the windowsill and the photograph of her grandfather on the fishing boat, and she took Rosie's drawings off the refrigerator, peeling them away one by one with hands that shook a little, but not too much, and she folded them carefully into a manila envelope. She took the deed to the lot, which she had kept in a shoebox under her bed for 6 years, and she put it in her jacket pocket. She did not answer her phone. By evening, she had set up what she could in the shed, a camping lantern that had belonged to her grandfather, and which still worked on a 20-year-old set of batteries, which she took as a small sign. A pile of blankets, a plastic tub of canned food from the back of her pantry, mostly soup and beans, and one inexplicable can of artichoke hearts that had been a gift from a coworker 3 Christmases ago. A jug of water from the tap at the gas station, where Marge had looked at her filling it up and had said nothing, which was the kindest thing Marge could have done. A small camp stove with half a canister of butane. Rosie's school backpack, set carefully in the corner where the roof was tightest and the water would not get in. The shed was not a home. It was barely a shelter, but it had 4 walls and a roof, and it belonged to her, and nobody could take it away as long as she paid the taxes, which she could not pay, which meant she had maybe 8 months before the county came for it, which was 8 months more than she had anywhere else. Rosie, exploring the shed like it was a castle, found a loose board on the inner wall and pulled on it, and the board came away in her hand, and she held it up with a solemn expression, as if she had just performed a magic trick of uncertain moral character. "Mom, it was loose." "That's okay, sweetie. We'll fix it." "There's something back here." Delia turned, not quite paying attention. "Probably a mouse nest, honey. Don't put your hand in there." "No, it's paper." Delia came over and knelt down. Behind the loose board, wedged into the narrow gap between the inner wall and the outer siding, was a folded square of paper, yellowed and soft with age. Rosie handed it to her like she was giving her a fallen leaf. Delia unfolded it carefully. It was brittle along the creases, and it came apart a little at the edges, but it was readable. It was a piece of graph paper, the old-fashioned kind with the greenish tint, and on it someone had drawn a map. A crude map, in pencil, heavily erased and redrawn in places. The map showed a rough rectangle that Delia recognized, with a small shock, as the shape of the lot. The creek was marked, and the old cottonwood, and the location of the shed. And in the center of the rectangle, near what would have been the lowest point, where the water stood even in dry summers, there was a small X and a notation in her grandfather's unmistakable, blocky handwriting. The notation read, "Course Sample 11B, 37, Fort C Drive, Ansell's Letter, October 1974. Below that, in a slightly different ink, as if added later, her grandfather had written, "The ground keeps its own books." Delia sat down on the floor of the shed. She sat down more heavily than she meant to. Rosie looked at her with some concern, and Delia managed a smile, and she said, "It's okay, baby. Mama just got a little dizzy." "What's the paper?" "I don't know yet," Delia said. And that was the truth. She did not sleep that night. She lay on the blanket next to Rosie, and she listened to the rain, and she thought about her grandfather, and she thought about the lot, and she thought about a thing he had said to her when she was maybe 11, a year or so after the porch conversation about the ground keeping its own books. They had been out fishing, he and she, on a slow bend of the Mercer River, and she had asked him what he did before he retired, because she had realized that she had never actually known. He had worked as a surveyor, he had said, not for the town, for a private company, out of Missoula, that did geological surveys. Mineral surveys, mostly. He had worked that job for almost 30 years, all over Montana and Idaho and Oregon and down into Northern California. And then he had come home to Mercer Hollow when his own father had died, and he had inherited the house on Elm Street. A surveyor. A mineral surveyor. And he had bought a useless piece of swampy land in 1971, and he had refused to sell it in 1986, and he had kept paying the taxes on it every year until he died. And he had left behind a map, hidden in the wall of a shed, with a notation about a core sample and a reference to a letter from someone named Dr. Ansell dated October of 1974. Delia lay awake in the dark, and she felt, for the first time in 11 months, something that was not quite hope, but was maybe hope's distant cousin. Something harder than hope. Something closer to suspicion. The suspicion that the ground had, in fact, kept its own books, and that her grandfather had known what was in them, and that he had left her, along with a deed and a box of fishing lures and a crocheted blanket, the key to reading the ledger. She did not know yet what any of it meant. She did not know if the map was real or if it was the half-serious doodle of an old man who had liked his private jokes. She did not know if Dr. Ansel had ever existed or if the letter from October 1974 was still anywhere in the world. She did not know if the course sample, if there had been a course sample, had shown anything worth the paper it was written on. But she knew, now, that she was not going to take Harlan Pike's $400. She knew that much. In the morning, she walked with Rosie down to the edge of the standing water, and she looked out across the lot in the thin gray light, and she tried to see it the way her grandfather must have seen it. The cattails, the brown water, the fallen cottonwood, the pale, drowned grass. She tried to see the ground underneath the ground, the rock and the sand, and whatever it was that her grandfather had known was down there. She could not see it. She was not a surveyor. She was a paralegal with $4 and a daughter and a shed. But the ground was there, and the map was in her pocket. And her grandfather, dead almost 12 years, had left her something. She took Rosie's hand. They walked back to the shed. The rain was starting to ease for the first time in almost 2 weeks. She drove into town that afternoon, and she went to the Mercer Hollow Public Library, which had been a single-room Carnegie building since 1911 and still smelled the way libraries were supposed to smell, like paper and old glue and the quiet persistence of ideas. The librarian was a woman named Iris Halloway, who had been the librarian for 35 years and who was one of the few people in town Delia still trusted, because Iris had never, in all the months of Delia's decline, given her a single pitying look. Iris had treated her exactly the same on the day she walked in broke and exhausted as she had on the day 8 years ago, when Delia had come in proud and newly hired to get a library card for her new apartment. There were not many people left in Mercer Hollow who could do that. Iris could. "I need to find some old records," Delia said, settling Rosie at the kids' table with a pile of picture books. From the 70s. "A geologist or a surveyor named Dr. Ansel. I don't know a first name. I don't even know if that's the right spelling." Iris looked at her over the top of her reading glasses. She did not ask why. She did not ask anything. She simply said, "Let's see what we can find." What they found, over the course of the next 4 hours, while Rosie worked her way through a stack of books about horses and dolphins, and one improbable book about a pig who wanted to be a ballerina, was this. Dr. Morton Ansel had been a geologist at the State University from 1962 to 1991. He had specialized in what the library's sole reference book on the subject called Subsurface Anomaly Analysis in Glacial Deposit Regions. Iris read that phrase aloud with the slow pleasure of a person who enjoyed a good mouthful of jargon, and then she looked up over her glasses and said, "In English, Delia, that means he looked for unusual things buried under old glacier tracks. And this whole county used to be one big glacier track, back when there were glaciers. So he would have had plenty to look at around here. Do any of his papers still exist? If they do, they'd be in the university archive. I can make some calls." Iris made the calls. Iris, Delia would later think, made every call that mattered in that long, strange, pivotal week. She called the university archive. She called a retired colleague of Dr. Ansel's who was still living in a retirement community outside the county seat. She called the county records office. She called the State Geological Survey. She called, over the course of 2 afternoons, no fewer than 11 different offices and individuals, and she did it all with the mild, persistent, unhurried courtesy of a small-town librarian who had spent her entire career helping people find things, and who understood that the trick to finding things was simply to refuse, politely, and without drama, to stop looking. By Friday afternoon, the day Mr. Harvey was going to have the sheriff come to Delia's apartment to change the locks, Iris had tracked down a photocopy of a single page from an unpublished report Dr. Ansel had submitted to a private client in November of 1974. The report was labeled Preliminary Core Analysis, Grange Parcel, Mercer County, and the client of record was listed as one Elias Grange, Delia's grandfather. Iris handed the photocopy to Delia across the library counter. Her hand was not entirely steady. Iris's hand never shook about anything, not in all the years Delia had known her. It was shaking a little now. "Read it," Iris said quietly. Delia read it. She read it once quickly and once slowly, and then a third time, because her eyes kept sliding off the words the way eyes do when the words are saying something too big to absorb in one pass. The report was technical. Most of it Delia did not understand. There were references to strata and to depth measurements and to something called assay ratios, and to the percentage composition of various minerals in samples taken from 11 different points on the parcel, at depths ranging from 12 feet to 41 feet below the surface. The language was dry, academic, precise. The language was not what made Iris's hand shake. What made Iris's hand shake was the conclusion paragraph at the bottom of the page, which Dr. Ansell had written in a careful, scholarly tone that did nothing to hide what it was saying. The core samples, Dr. Ansell had written, indicate the presence of a substantial and commercially significant deposit beneath the subject parcel, with particular concentration in the lower quadrant. Preliminary estimates suggest the deposit is of sufficient size and quality to warrant full extraction analysis. Client is advised that the surface condition of the parcel, including seasonal inundation, is likely to significantly depress market value and assessed property value, which may be advantageous to the client's interest in retaining ownership without external attention. Further analysis recommended pending client's wishes. Delia stared at the page. "Iris," she said, "I know. What does that mean? Substantial and commercially significant deposit of what?" "The report doesn't say." "It doesn't say?" "Not on this page." Iris pushed her glasses up her nose. "The retired colleague I spoke with said Dr. Ansell did a lot of confidential work for private clients, and he was known for writing initial reports that were deliberately vague about the nature of the find, because he believed the first report was the most likely to be leaked or intercepted. The full analysis, with the specific mineral breakdown, would have been delivered separately, in a second letter, a letter that your grandfather would have received in, probably late October or early November of 1974. Dr. Ansell's letter, October 1974, Delia said. The words from the map. "Yes. So somewhere," Delia said, very slowly, "there is a letter that says what is under my grandfather's land." "Yes. And my grandfather knew." "Yes. And he did not sell." "No, he did not." Delia sat down on the stool behind the library counter. She sat down because her legs had, quite suddenly, stopped working. Rosie looked up from her book about the ballerina pig, and Delia gave her a thumbs up, because the language of thumbs up was the language they had developed over the last 11 months, the language that meant "I am okay, we are okay, do not worry." Rosie went back to her book. "Iris," Delia said, "where is the letter?" Iris folded her hands on the library counter, and she looked at Delia with the mild, bottomless patience of a woman who had spent her entire life watching people find the things they were looking for. "That, honey," she said, "is what we are going to find out next." It was on the drive back out to the shed, in the last gray hour of that long Friday afternoon, with Rosie asleep in the back seat and the photocopy folded carefully in her jacket pocket, that Delia understood, fully and for the first time, what had happened to her. She had driven out to this land 3 nights ago with $4 and a sleeping child, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing, because hoping for things had become a luxury she could no longer afford. She had come here because she had run out of other places to go. She had come here to a piece of ground that everyone in Mercer Hollow, including herself, had believed to be worthless, and she had been prepared to live in a shed on that worthless ground for as long as it took to figure out what came next. And the ground had been waiting for her. That was the thing. The ground had been waiting. It had been waiting since 1971, when her grandfather had bought it for $200. It had been waiting since 1974, when Dr. Ansell had driven 11 core samples into its silent, patient body and had written a report that told a man with the good sense to keep his mouth shut that there was something down there worth keeping. It had been waiting since 1986, when the town had laughed at her grandfather for refusing $400. It had been waiting through every spring flood and every autumn rain and every long summer when the cattails grew back and the water receded and the grass came up pale and drowned, and the people of Mercer Hollow drove past on the gravel road and shook their heads and said, "Look at that useless piece of swamp." It had been waiting for her. Delia turned off the gravel road and onto the lot, and she killed the engine, and she sat in the car with her hands on the wheel, and she looked out at the rectangle of land that was hers, and that had always been hers, and that she was, for the first time in her life, actually seeing. The rain had stopped. The clouds were thinning out over the western hills, and there was a wet, silver light coming down across the cattails, and the water standing on the lower quadrant of the lot had taken on a still, mirrored quality, so that it was reflecting the sky almost perfectly, and the whole lot looked, for one long, strange moment, like a piece of heaven that had fallen down and settled into the low place between Copper Creek and the Mercer River. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Harlan Pike. She knew it was Harlan Pike without looking. His offer expired today. The 48 hours were up, and this was his last call, the call he had warned her about, the call that was meant to close the door behind her. She let it ring. She let it go to voicemail. She did not listen to the voicemail. Rosie stirred in the back seat. "Mom, are we home?" Delia looked at her daughter in the rearview mirror. She looked at the small, pale face with its ring of freckles and its serious eyes. She looked at the stuffed fox clutched in the crook of Rosie's arm. "Yeah, baby," she said, very quietly, so quietly that Rosie could not hear her. "I think we are." That night in the shed, with Rosie asleep and the camping lantern turned down low, Delia unfolded the photocopy on her lap and read it again by the yellow light. She read it maybe 15 times. She was not, she realized somewhere around the 8th reading, trying to extract any new information from it. She was simply making sure it was real. She was making sure it would still say the same thing if she looked away and looked back. And each time she looked back, it said the same thing. Substantial and commercially significant deposit. Sufficient size and quality to warrant full extraction analysis. The photocopy was real. The words were real. The ground outside the shed, dark and wet and quiet, was real. She did not know how to proceed. That was the thing that kept her from sleeping. She did not know how a person proceeded. In a situation like this, when that person was a 34-year-old broke paralegal with no money for lawyers, no money for geologists, no money for anything, who was living in a shed with a 7-year-old child, and who had maybe 8 months before the county came for the taxes. She did not know who to call. She did not know who to trust. She did not know what the first step was. But she knew, from her years at the firm, one thing about situations like this. She knew that when you were sitting on something valuable, the worst thing you could do was let people know you were sitting on it before you knew what to do with it. Because the minute other people knew, other people would come. Harlan Pike was not the worst of it. Harlan Pike was the first shallow tide. Behind Harlan Pike, there were mining companies, land speculators, lawyers who specialized in separating people from mineral rights they did not know how to keep. There were cousins she had not spoken to in 15 years who would suddenly remember that they were family. There were county officials who would find, if they went looking, reasons to revisit the assessment on the lot, reasons to flag the title, reasons to suggest that a property of unusual characteristics might benefit from a more active stewardship. Her grandfather had known this. That was why the report had used the word advantageous. That was why the report had noted that the surface condition of the parcel was likely to depress market value, and that this might be advantageous to the client's interest in retaining ownership without external attention. Dr. Ansell had understood, back in 1974, exactly what he was writing. He had been advising Elias Grange to keep his mouth shut, and her grandfather, who had been a man born with his mouth already shut on most subjects, had taken the advice and had run with it for the next 35 years until the day he died. Delia folded the photocopy. She put it in the manila envelope with Rosie's drawings. She put the manila envelope inside the deed, which she had folded into a plastic freezer bag, which she had slid down the inner lining of her jacket through a small tear she had made for exactly this purpose. She was not going to let the photocopy out of her sight. She was not going to let the deed out of her sight. She was not. She understood with the sudden lucidity that comes at 2 in the morning in a tin-roofed shed, going to let anyone in Mercer Hollow know, for as long as she could possibly manage, that there was anything at all under the ground. She would find the letter. She would find the letter on her own, with Iris's help, and she would find out what was down there, and then she would figure out what to do next. Until then, the lot was a swamp. Until then, the shed was a shed. Until then, Delia Grange was still the broke paralegal who had been evicted on a Friday and who was sleeping in the place nobody wanted. Let them think it. Let them all think it. She slept, finally, in the last hour before dawn, with one arm around Rosie and the other over the jacket that held the paper that held the secret. Saturday morning brought clear weather and cold wind. Delia made oatmeal on the camp stove, using the last of the oats from the pantry tub, and she watched Rosie eat it with a small plastic spoon, and she tried to plan. The planning went in circles. Every plan required money. Money required work. Work required transportation and clean clothes and a phone that was not about to be shut off for non-payment. And all of those things required money. And the circle closed on itself over and over until Delia could feel the panic starting to rise up in her chest the way it had been rising up every day for months. She breathed through it. She had learned how to breathe through it. The trick, the therapist she could no longer afford had told her, was to stop trying to solve everything at once. The trick was to pick one thing. Just one thing. The smallest possible next thing. And do that thing. The smallest possible next thing was to go back to the library. She drove Rosie into town. Iris was not on duty that Saturday, but she had left a note for Delia with the substitute, a young woman named Claire who did not ask any questions and who simply handed Delia a manila folder with her name written on it. Inside the folder was a printed email thread between Iris and a woman named Dr. Patricia Halvorsen, who was identified in Iris's careful handwritten margin note as Dr. Ansell's former graduate student, retired, lives in Corvallis. Delia sat at one of the library tables and read the email thread. Rosie sat beside her with a new stack of books. Dr. Halvorsen, according to the emails, had worked as Dr. Ansell's graduate assistant from 1972 through 1975. She had, by her own account, personally transcribed many of his field reports during that period, including, she believed, reports pertaining to private clients in Mercer County. She remembered Dr. Ansell's filing system vividly, she said, because she had designed it. Private client letters were filed in a locked cabinet in his office, organized by client surname. When Dr. Ansell retired in 1991, he had kept his professional papers but had donated most of his private client files to the university archive, with the stipulation that they be sealed for 50 years. The seal, Dr. Halvorsen had noted in her second email, would not expire until 2041. But, Dr. Halvorsen had added, there was a secondary set of files that Dr. Ansell had maintained at his home in Corvallis, and these had never been donated anywhere. When he died in 2003, his papers had passed to his son, Andrew Ansell, who was a retired engineer now living in Eugene. If Delia was looking for a letter from Dr. Ansell to a private client from the 1970s, the most likely place for it to exist, Dr. Halvorsen had written, was in the home of Andrew Ansell. Iris had attached a phone number. Delia stared at the phone number for a long time. Then she folded the paper, tucked it into her jacket, and walked Rosie down to the pay phone outside the post office, which was one of maybe 4 working pay phones left in the entire county and which, miraculously, still accepted coins. She had 2 quarters left from the gas station coffee. She used both. The phone rang 4 times. A man's voice answered, pleasant and guarded in the way of elderly men who received too many calls from scammers. Andrew Ansell? Speaking. Mr. Ansell, my name is Delia Grange. My grandfather was Elias Grange. He was a client of your father's, back in the 1970s. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Delia pressed the phone hard against her ear, as if she could force clarity through the plastic. Grange, Andrew Ansell said slowly. Yes, I remember that name. You remember it? My father had a few clients he spoke about more than others. Your grandfather was one of them. I don't know the specifics. I was a kid, but I remember the name. They corresponded for years. A pause. May I ask what this is about, Miss Grange? Delia took a breath. She had rehearsed, on the walk to the pay phone, a dozen versions of what she might say. In the end, she said the simplest one. I found a map my grandfather drew. It references a letter from your father, dated October of 1974. I believe the letter concerns some land my grandfather owned. Land I now own. I'm trying to locate that letter. Another long silence. Ms. Grange, Andrew Ansell said, I kept all of my father's papers. I have his private correspondence files in my basement, in the original cabinets. I haven't looked through them in years, but they're there. If there is a letter from October of 1974 concerning your grandfather, it will be in those files. Delia closed her eyes. She leaned her forehead against the cool metal of the pay phone enclosure. Mr. Ansell, she said, I cannot pay you for the time it will take to find it. I want to be honest with you about that. I am going through a difficult period. I do not have the money to compensate you for your trouble. Ms. Grange, Andrew Ansell said, and his voice had gone soft in a way that made something catch in Delia's chest. My father worked for your grandfather. My father was paid, at the time, for the work. Any letter in my possession that was written to your grandfather belongs, morally if not legally, to your grandfather's estate, which means it belongs to you. I will not charge you a penny to look for it. Thank you, Delia said. Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. I will call you back tomorrow evening. Is this the best number? No, sir. This is a pay phone. I don't have a reliable number right now. Can I call you back? Yes. Call me Sunday evening. 7 o'clock my time. I will have looked by then. Delia hung up the phone. She stood with her hand on the receiver for a long moment. Rosie tugged at her jacket. Who was that, Mom? That was a very kind man, sweetheart. Is he going to help us? I think so, Delia said. I think he's going to try. They walked back, toward the Corolla. On the way, they passed the diner on Main, and through the plate glass window Delia saw, sitting at the counter nursing a cup of coffee, Harlan Pike. He saw her through the window at the same moment she saw him. He lifted his cup to her in a small, mocking salute. She did not return it. She walked past the window with her back straight and Rosie's hand in hers, and she did not look back, and she did not let him see that she had noticed him at all. That afternoon, back at the shed, she set Rosie up with her drawing pad, and she walked the lot. Really walked it, for the first time, with the photocopy folded in her pocket and the map in her hand. She tried to match the X on her grandfather's map to a physical location on the ground. The lower quadrant, Dr. Ansell's report had said. Particular concentration in the lower quadrant. She walked down to where the standing water was deepest, where the cattails grew thickest, where the ground was softest under her boots, and she stood there for a long time in the cold sun. The lower quadrant. She was standing on it. Whatever her grandfather had known was down there was, if the report and the map were to be believed, under the mud beneath her feet, at 37 feet of depth, in a deposit that Dr. Ansell had called substantial and commercially significant. She did not know what it was. She would not know for another 24 hours. But standing there in the cold sun, on ground that had been waiting for her since before she was born, Delia Grange felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. She felt ownership. Not the legal kind. The other kind. The kind her grandfather must have felt the first day he walked this lot in 1971 with Dr. Ansell's preliminary findings in his pocket and the knowledge in his chest that other people would see one thing and he would see another. She stood there until Rosie called for her from the shed, and then she walked back up the slope, and she made dinner on the camp stove, and she helped Rosie brush her teeth with a bottle of water, and she tucked her daughter in on the blanket pile with the stuffed fox and the library book about horses, and she sat up by the yellow light of the lantern, and she waited for Sunday. Sunday was the longest day of her life. The longest day, at least, since the day she had sat in the hospital parking lot after Rosie's surgery. She tried to fill it with small tasks. She swept the shed. She organized the cans in the pantry tub. She walked the lot 3 more times. She drew, with Rosie, a picture of the shed and the cattails, and she pinned the picture to the wall next to Rosie's bed, which was how she had started to think of the blanket pile as Rosie's bed, because calling it a blanket pile felt like an admission she was not yet ready to make aloud. At 6 o'clock she drove into town. The pay phone was still there. The pay phone had not moved. She had $1.70 in change, scraped together from the bottom of the Corolla's cup holders and from a forgotten pocket in her winter coat. At 7 o'clock exactly, by the clock on the bank across the street, she dialed Andrew Ansell's number. He picked up on the first ring. Ms. Grange. Mr. Ansell. I found the letter. She had to put her hand flat against the wall of the pay phone enclosure to keep standing. I found 2 letters, actually, he said. A preliminary summary dated October 3rd, 1974, and a detailed analysis dated October 28th, 1974. The detailed analysis is 4 pages long. It includes the full mineral breakdown, the estimated deposit tonnage, the projected extraction parameters, and my father's personal recommendations to your grandfather regarding disposition of the property. Mr. Ansell, Ms. Grange, before I tell you what the letters say, I want you to sit down, if you are not already sitting down. I'm at a payphone. Then lean against something. She leaned. All right, she said. I'm ready. The deposit on your grandfather's property, Andrew Ansell said, is lithium. A very pure, very concentrated lithium brine deposit, held in an ancient lakebed formation that your grandfather's parcel sits almost perfectly on top of. My father's 1974 assessment estimated the deposit at somewhere between 16 and 22,000 metric tons of extractable lithium carbonate equivalent. At 1974 prices, that would have been a significant but not extraordinary find. At today's prices, Ms. Grange, he paused, as if he were not quite sure how to say the next part. At today's prices, your lot is worth, at a very conservative estimate, somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 million. Delia did not say anything. She could not say anything. Her mouth had stopped working. Her hand on the receiver had stopped working. Her knees, she noticed distantly, were continuing to work, which was lucky, because she was standing on them. Ms. Grange, are you still there? Yes, she managed. I'm still here. Ms. Grange, there is one other thing in the detailed analysis that I think you will want to know. My father specifically advised your grandfather, in writing, to do 3 things. First, never to sell the land, under any circumstances, to any party, at any price. Second, to allow the surface condition of the parcel to remain degraded, to discourage speculation and preserve a low assessed value. And third, Andrew Ansell's voice caught, for just a moment, and Delia heard in the catch something that sounded almost like a smile. Third, my father advised your grandfather to leave the information, when he passed, to a member of his family who had, in my father's words, demonstrated the good sense and the good character to be trusted with what is under the ground. Delia did not answer. She could not. Ms. Grange, Andrew Ansell said, very gently. It seems your grandfather believed that was you. She stood at the pay phone for a long time after she hung up. She stood there until Rosie, who had been waiting in the Corolla, got out and came over and tugged on the hem of her jacket and asked, in a small voice, if everything was okay. Delia looked down at her daughter. She looked at the small, serious face. She looked at the ring of freckles. She looked at the hand tugging at the hem of her jacket, the hand that had not let go of her in 11 months, the hand that had held on through the hospital and the eviction and the shed and the rain. Yes, baby, she said. Everything is okay. And for the first time since the bills had started coming, since the firm had let her go, since the apartment had slipped out from under her, since she had counted $4 on a folding table in a laundromat on a Tuesday night, she meant it. The rain had stopped. The clouds were moving off. And for the first time in a very long time, Delia Grange was not afraid of what tomorrow was going to bring. She did not sleep that Sunday night. She lay on the blanket pile beside Rosie and she stared up at the gaps in the tin roof where the stars were coming through in small, hard, white pinpricks, and she tried to understand what had happened to her in the last 6 hours. $400 million. The number sat in her chest like something that had been swallowed whole, that had not yet begun to digest, that might, if she looked at it too directly, turn out to be something her body rejected. $400 million. The words did not mean anything to her. They were an abstraction, a quantity that belonged to people on television and to characters in novels, and to the men who had owned the firm she had worked at, men she had never met, men whose names were on the letterhead, but whose faces she would not have recognized on the street. $400 million did not belong to a woman who lived in a shed with a 7-year-old and a camping lantern and a can of artichoke hearts. And yet Andrew Ansell had said it. He had said it in the calm, considered voice of an engineer who had done the arithmetic twice before speaking. He had said it in the tone of a man who had no reason to lie and no reason to inflate the number and no stake in Delia Grange's belief or disbelief. He had said it, and the words were out, and Delia had hung up the pay phone and walked back to the Corolla in a state that she could not, afterward, quite describe. Not joy, not relief, something stranger, something closer to the way people were said to feel immediately after an accident, before the adrenaline wore off, when the body understood that something enormous had happened but had not yet decided what kind of enormous. She lay in the dark beside her daughter and she understood, slowly, that the danger had not ended. The danger had changed. It had changed into something more subtle and in some ways worse, because it was a danger she did not yet know how to see. Until that evening, her danger had been ordinary. It had been rent and utilities and the sheriff on Friday. It had been the kind of danger that broke women every day all over the country, in small rooms with thin walls, and that required from its victims nothing more than stamina. The new danger was different. The new danger was the kind that came for people who had something. Her grandfather had understood it. Dr. Ansel had understood it. That was what the 35 years of careful concealment had been about. That was why the word advantageous had sat in the report like a small, patient warning to any future reader with the wit to notice it. The minute the world found out what was under the lot, the world would come for it. Not with violence, probably, although she could not even rule that out. With lawyers, with title searches, with county assessors who would discover, upon reflection, that an error had been made somewhere, and that the paperwork on the old Grange parcel required revisiting. With mining companies whose representatives would arrive in polite cars wearing polite shoes, carrying contracts that were full of clauses Delia would not fully understand even with her paralegal training, because the clauses that mattered were never the ones you were supposed to focus on. With cousins, with distant, estranged relatives who would suddenly remember that blood was thicker than water, and who would begin, with a lawyer or two of their own, to raise questions about the exact chain of inheritance between Elias Grange and his daughter and his daughter's daughter, and who would produce, with surprising speed, theories about why their own claim deserved consideration. She could not let it out. That was the first thing she understood, lying in the dark. She could not let it out for as long as she could possibly hold it in. And every day she held it in was a day during which she had to find, from nothing, the specific people who could help her and the specific steps that would let her protect what her grandfather had protected for 3.5 decades on his own. She had to do this with no money, no leverage, no credentials, and no support system worth the name. She had to do it while living in a shed, while raising a child, while continuing to look, to everyone in Mercer Hollow, like exactly what they thought she was, which was a woman who had run out of rope and was now hanging from the knot at the end of it. She could do this. That was the second thing she understood. She could do this because her grandfather had, in effect, given her 35 years of cover. The lot looked worthless. The lot would continue to look worthless. The lot was, to anyone standing on its gravel access road in the wet spring light, a sad piece of floodplain that had been the subject of a minor town joke for 2 generations. The disguise was already in place. She did not have to build it. She only had to maintain it. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep, but she closed her eyes, and she began, methodically, to make a list in her head of the people she would need. A lawyer, not in Mercer Hollow, not even in the county seat. A lawyer somewhere else, at least 2 hours away, somewhere no one in town would know to look. A lawyer who specialized in mineral rights, or who knew someone who did. A lawyer who would take her on for nothing up front, in exchange for some percentage of whatever she eventually recovered. Paralegals knew, from watching their bosses, that such lawyers existed. Paralegals also knew that such lawyers were usually hard to find, often eccentric, occasionally brilliant, and almost always operating on the margins of mainstream practice because the margins were where the interesting work tended to live. A geologist, someone independent, someone who could quietly confirm Dr. Ansel's 1974 findings with modern equipment without filing anything in any public database that would tip off anyone who was watching. This was going to be harder. Dr. Patricia Halvorsen, the retired graduate student in Corvallis, was possibly the right person if she was willing. An ally in the county offices. A long shot. Delia did not know of anyone in the Mercer County offices who would take her side against the town's own interests. The county assessor and the county attorney and the county clerk had all grown up in Mercer Hollow, had all gone to school together, and would all, if they learned what was under her lot, find themselves in an awkward triangle between their professional duties, their personal loyalties, and the mild, persistent political pressure that any small county exerted on its own employees when a matter of local interest was in play. Delia could not count on any of them. Delia had to assume that once the secret broke, every county office was going to be, if not actively hostile, then at best cautiously neutral, which in practice was the same thing. And an ally in her own life. Someone who knew. Someone who could be trusted absolutely, with whom she could share the burden, because she understood already, at 2 in the morning in the tin shed, that the burden by itself would break her. $400 million, carried alone by a broke woman in a shed, would eat through her ribs in a month. She needed someone to help her carry it. Iris. It would have to be Iris. She thought about it for a long time in the dark. She thought about the risks. She thought about what it meant to tell another human being, any other human being, what was under the lot. She thought about whether Iris could be trusted, and she thought about the fact that trust was a question you could never fully answer in advance, that it was always a leap, that her grandfather had leaped with Dr. Ansel in 1974 and had been rewarded for it, and that she was going to have to leap with someone, and that Iris Holloway, who had spent 35 years helping people in Mercer Hollow find things, and who had never once, in all those years, told anyone's business at the checkout line, was the closest thing Delia had to a guaranteed landing. She would tell Iris. She would tell Iris tomorrow. She slept eventually, in the hour before dawn, the way she had slept the night she found the map, with one arm around her daughter and the other over the jacket. Monday morning was cold and clear. Delia got up at first light and made coffee on the camp stove using the instant grounds Iris had slipped into the Friday folder along with the email thread, a small gesture of care that Delia had not commented on because commenting on it would have made them both uncomfortable. She drank the coffee standing in the door of the shed, watching the sun come up over the ridge to the east and watching the cattails light up orange along the waterline. Rosie slept. Rosie always slept late when she could. Delia watched her daughter's breath come and go, small and steady, and she thought, I have to not screw this up. That is the only rule. I have to not screw this up, for her sake, for whatever number of years it takes. She drove Rosie to school at 7:30. Mercer Hollow Elementary was a two-story brick building that had been built in 1952 and had been added to twice since, and it was the one institution in the town that Delia still trusted without reservation, because Rosie loved it, and because Rosie's teacher, Mrs. Harper, had been, throughout the whole long year of the illness and the eviction, a kind of quiet, steady, unspoken counterweight to everything else. Mrs. Harper had never asked Delia a single embarrassing question. Mrs. Harper had made sure Rosie got the free breakfast in the lunchroom without ever speaking the words free breakfast aloud in front of Rosie. Mrs. Harper had sent home, in Rosie's backpack on a Friday in January, an envelope with $40 in it, and a note that said only I was cleaning out my desk and found this. Thought of Rosie, please use it for anything. And Delia had sat on the edge of her bed that night with the envelope in her lap, and had understood that some forms of grace did not announce themselves. She kissed Rosie at the front door of the school. She told her to have a good day. She drove downtown. Iris was already at the library. Iris had opened the library that day at 7, an hour early, because she had known, without Delia needing to say anything, that Delia was going to come in first thing. Iris was sitting at the counter with 2 cups of coffee in front of her, one of them for Delia, when Delia walked in. Tell me, Iris said. Delia sat down. She put her hands around the coffee cup. She looked at Iris for a long moment, the small, gray-haired woman with the reading glasses and the cardigan and the mild, bottomless patience, and she thought, you are about to change this woman's life, whether she wants you to or not. Be careful, she told her. She told her everything. The phone call, the number, the lithium, the lakebed, the 1974 advice, the 3 specific instructions her grandfather had been given and had, apparently, followed for the rest of his life. She told her about the lawyer she would need and the geologist she would need and the discipline that would be required to keep the lot looking like exactly what it had always looked like for as long as humanly possible. She told her about Harlan Pike, and about the cousins she had not spoken to in 15 years, and about her sense that the danger had not ended but had changed into something she did not yet know how to see. Iris listened without interrupting. Iris listened the way Iris always listened, with her hands folded on the counter and her reading glasses low on her nose and her eyes fixed on Delia's face with a kind of steady attention that made Delia feel, for the first time in a very long time, that she was not alone inside her own story. When Delia was finished, Iris did not speak for a while. She picked up her coffee. She took a sip. She set the cup down. Delia, she said, I am going to tell you something I have never told anyone in Mercer Hollow. Okay. My husband, God rest him, worked for the state attorney general's office for 22 years. He was not a lawyer. He was an investigator. His job was to quietly look into situations where something was wrong and nobody in the local county was willing to do anything about it. He retired in 2009. He died in 2014. Before he died, he put me in touch with 3 people he said I should contact if I ever had a situation that was too big for the sheriff or the county attorney. One of those people was a lawyer in Boise named Francis Delbridge. Francis specializes in mineral rights and private property disputes. She does not advertise. She does not have a website. She takes clients by referral only. She takes many of her clients on contingency, which means she works for a percentage of the recovery. My husband said she was the best he ever worked with, and my husband, God rest him, was not a man who used the word best lightly. Delia did not say anything. She could not. Her throat had closed up a little, around the quiet, terrible realization that Iris had been carrying, for a decade, a small package of emergency contacts left to her by a man she had loved, and that she was, at this moment, preparing to spin one of them on Delia. I will call Frances this afternoon, Iris said. I will tell her what you have told me. If she is willing, she will call you back. If you can get to Boise, she will meet with you in person. Boise is 9 hours from here. You will need to figure out a way to make that trip. I don't have. I know you don't, honey. Let me think about it. Now, about the geologist. I think Dr. Halvorsen in Corvallis is exactly the right person. I also think she has to be approached very carefully, because she knew your grandfather's file by reputation even if not by detail, and she will understand immediately what the stakes are. I will write to her myself, from this library's letterhead, which is an institution she will not confuse with anything else. I will ask her if she is willing to come out here, quietly, at her convenience, and perform a confirmatory reading with modern equipment. I will tell her that compensation will be arranged at a later date from the proceeds of the property, and I will trust her, as your grandfather trusted her professor, to understand. Iris. Yes. Why are you doing this? Iris took off her reading glasses. She cleaned them slowly on the edge of her cardigan. She put them back on. Because your grandfather, she said, used to come into this library every Thursday afternoon for the last 18 years of his life to read the geology journals we had on subscription, which we had on subscription because he had paid for the subscription personally for all 18 of those years, out of his own pocket, with the understanding that I never mention it to anyone. He died in the spring of 2012. We canceled the subscription that fall. I have thought about your grandfather, Delia, not infrequently, in the years since. I have thought about what a quiet, intelligent, stubborn man he was, and about what it must have been like to hold a secret as long as he held his. I did not know the specifics of his secret until yesterday afternoon when I read Dr. Ansell's preliminary report. But I knew he had one. Librarians know. It is the one real benefit of the job. She smiled, small, dry. I am doing this, honey, because your grandfather was a friend of mine, in his own distant way, and because he would have wanted me to. And because I have been watching you since you were a girl, and I know, in the way that I know certain things, that you are going to handle this the way he would have handled it. Which is well. Delia put her face in her hands. She did not cry, quite. She breathed into her palms for a long moment, and when she took her hands away, her eyes were wet, but her face was steady. Thank you, she said. You're welcome. I don't know how to. You don't have to know yet. Let's start with Francis. Let's start with Dr. Halvorsen. Let's take this in small pieces. They took it in small pieces. Francis Delbridge called back on Tuesday afternoon, at 4 o'clock, on the pay phone outside the post office, Delia having left the pay phone number with Iris that morning for Iris to pass along. Francis had a voice that sounded like a woman in her late 50s who had smoked for 30 years and then quit for the last 15. A voice that was precise and warm and utterly without nonsense. She said she had spoken with Iris. She said she had reviewed, from what Iris had described, the general outline of Delia's situation. She said she was willing to take the case on contingency, at a rate of 18% of any eventual net recovery, with a written agreement that her fee would include not only the initial negotiation or litigation, but all reasonable follow-up representation for a period of 5 years, to ensure that Delia was not left, once the initial matter was resolved, to handle the long tail of complications on her own. Frances said that in her experience, the long tail was where most clients in situations like Delia's lost the ground they had gained in the initial settlement. Ms. Delbridge, Delia said, I have no money for travel. I have no money for anything. I don't know how I would get to Boise. Don't come to Boise, Frances said. I'll come to you. I'm living in a shed. I have slept in worse places in the course of my career, Frances said, than any shed in Mercer Hollow, Idaho, is likely to turn out to be. I will drive out on Friday. I will meet you at the library. Iris and I will figure out the specifics. You will not pay for my time. We are going to treat this, Ms. Grange, as an investment, on the premise that if what you have described is accurate, my 18% in 5 years will make this the most lucrative drive I have ever taken. I will expect you to be honest with me at every stage, to follow my advice in matters where I am more experienced than you are, and to understand that the first 6 to 12 months of our work together are going to be extremely slow, extremely patient, and extremely quiet, and will involve doing nothing dramatic in public while we do a great deal of necessary work in private. Can you do that? Yes, Delia said. Good. I will see you Friday. Frances came on Friday, exactly as she had said she would. She was a tall woman with short gray hair and a navy blue jacket that had been tailored at some point, but not recently. She came into the library at 10:30 in the morning. She shook Iris's hand, and she shook Delia's hand, and she sat down at one of the long wooden tables in the back of the library that Iris had, that morning, quietly marked as reserved for a private meeting. Frances opened a leather folder. She took out a yellow legal pad. She wrote the date at the top of the first page. All right, Ms. Grange, she said. Tell me the whole thing. Start with your grandfather buying the land in 1971. Don't skip anything. Don't worry about being repetitive. Don't worry about sounding crazy. Tell me all of it. Delia told her all of it. It took 2.5 hours. Iris brought coffee. Frances wrote on the legal pad in handwriting that was small and neat and fast. When Delia was finished, Frances turned to a fresh page and began sketching what looked, upside down to Delia, like a flow chart. She drew for about 10 minutes. She looked up. Here is what we are going to do, she said. First, we are going to place the property, this week, into a Nevada-based holding company whose sole member will be a revocable trust created for the benefit of you and your daughter. This will add a layer of opacity between your name and the parcel. It will not hide the underlying ownership from a determined lawyer, but it will discourage casual searches and will buy us weeks or months before any interested party in Mercer Hollow figures out what is going on. Second, we are going to retain Dr. Halvorsen, through Iris's existing correspondence, to perform a modern core sample reading and confirm the 1974 findings. This will take perhaps 8 weeks. Third, once we have a modern confirmation, we are going to approach 2, not 1, but 2, established mining concerns with private, non-disclosure protected preliminary inquiries to obtain informal valuations and to create what I will call, in the trade, a floor. Once we know the floor, we will know how to negotiate. She tapped the legal pad. Fourth, we are not, under any circumstances, going to file anything with Mercer County that could alert the county offices to the change in status. We are going to continue paying the property taxes at the existing assessed value, and we are going to do nothing that would prompt a reassessment. Fifth, you, Ms. Grange, are going to continue living as you are currently living. You are going to continue being, to the eyes of everyone in Mercer Hollow, a woman who has fallen on hard times and who is sleeping in a shed on her grandfather's old swamp lot. This is, I cannot emphasize this enough, the most important part of the plan. The disguise your grandfather built is our single greatest asset, and we must not damage it in any way for at least the next 8 to 12 months. Sixth, she paused. She looked up from the legal pad. She looked Delia directly in the eye. Sixth, she said, I am going to find a way to get you and your daughter out of that shed, into a small rental somewhere in this county, by next month, without doing anything that looks like a sudden change in your circumstances. Because I have represented enough clients in situations like this to know that a woman living in a shed with a 7-year-old child is a woman whose capacity to make careful, patient decisions over a 12-month period is going to be compromised by sheer physical exhaustion, and I cannot let that happen. We will handle it. Do you hear me? We will handle it. You are going to be able to think clearly. That is not optional. Delia could not speak for a moment. She looked at Frances. She looked at Iris. She looked at the legal pad with its small, neat handwriting and its flow chart. Yes, she said. Thank you. You're welcome. Let's get to work. They got to work. The next 8 weeks were, in their own strange, quiet way, the strangest of Delia's life. On the surface, nothing changed. Delia continued to live in the shed. Delia continued to drive Rosie to school every morning in the Corolla with its grinding transmission. Delia continued to count coins in the gas station lot. Delia took a part-time job at the laundromat, Beverly offering it to her 2 days after the Friday meeting with Francis, an offer made in Beverly's usual sideways fashion, without ceremony, a job that paid $78 a week under the table plus the use of the laundromat's small backroom, with a cot, for an hour after closing, where Rosie could do her homework while Delia cleaned up. The $78 a week did not, in the grand scheme of things, mean anything, but it meant a great deal to Delia, because it was real money that she had earned, and because having a job, any job, was a layer of camouflage that she and Francis had agreed was valuable. Beneath the surface, everything was moving. Francis filed the papers for the Nevada holding company. Francis drove back to Boise and returned 3 days later with a small, carefully drawn stack of documents for Delia to sign, documents that were full of language Delia only half understood, and that she signed anyway because Francis had explained each one in detail in advance and had told her, in her precise, unhurried voice, what each signature meant and what each did not mean. Iris wrote to Dr. Halvorsen. Dr. Halvorsen wrote back within 4 days. A long, careful letter in which she agreed to perform the confirmation work on a delayed compensation basis, and in which she included, in the second paragraph, a sentence that Iris later read aloud to Delia with a slight tremor in her voice. I will tell you, Miss Halloway, that I had long wondered what had become of the Grange parcel, and I am very glad indeed to learn that it is still in family hands and that it is still being handled with care. Dr. Halvorsen came to Mercer Hollow in the last week of April. She came alone, in a white Subaru wagon with organ plates, carrying equipment in hard plastic cases that she told curious onlookers at the gas station was archaeological survey gear, which was not exactly a lie and not exactly the truth, but which satisfied the 1 or 2 people who bothered to ask. She worked the lot over 2 days. She drilled 6 new core samples at depths ranging from 22 to 44 feet, at locations she had pre-selected from Dr. Ansell's original 1974 field notes, which Andrew Ansell had by that point mailed to Iris in a padded envelope along with a note that read, I hope these help. My father would be glad. Dr. Halvorsen worked in the mornings, before the few neighbors who might have been watching were out of bed, and in the late afternoons, when the sun was low and the lot looked, from a distance, like a piece of vacant ground being poked at by someone doing something uninteresting. On the evening of the second day, Dr. Halvorsen sat with Delia in the shed, on a folding chair Iris had lent her, and she explained her findings. The findings were consistent with Dr. Ansell's 1974 report. The deposit was real. The deposit was, if anything, slightly larger than Dr. Ansell had estimated, because modern equipment was more sensitive and could detect the deposit's boundaries more precisely. The lithium brine was of extremely high purity. The lakebed formation extended almost exactly under the lot's property lines, with only a small portion extending slightly onto neighboring land, which, Dr. Halvorsen noted with a small dry smile, was a matter Francis would want to think about. Ms. Grange, she said, at the end of the conversation, your grandfather was a careful man. I did not know him, but I knew his file. I want you to know that I will prepare my final written report, and I will deliver it only to you and to Ms. Delbridge, and I will destroy my working notes before I leave town. I will not retain a copy. I will not speak of this work to anyone, not even to my colleagues at the university. The integrity of what your grandfather did for you, and of what your family has built here, is something I feel some personal responsibility toward preserving. Dr. Ansell's decision to trust your grandfather in 1974 is, in a small way, my inheritance too. I want you to understand that I take it seriously. Delia nodded. She did not trust herself to speak. Dr. Halvorsen left the next morning, early, before Delia was properly awake. She left behind, on the folding chair, a sealed envelope that contained her final report, along with a small stone. Delia picked up the stone. It was not a special stone. It was a gray, rounded river stone, about the size of a hen's egg. There was no note with it. Delia understood that there did not need to be a note. She put the stone on the windowsill of the shed, where the morning light came through, and she left it there. In early May, Francis made the first informal contact with a mining concern. She did it through a cutout, a Boise-based geological consulting firm that owed Francis a favor and that agreed to make, on its own letterhead, and without mentioning Delia's name, a preliminary inquiry to a division of a large publicly traded lithium extraction company based in Denver. The inquiry was phrased as a theoretical one. A private client in the Pacific Northwest had inherited a parcel that preliminary analysis suggested might contain a commercially significant lithium brine deposit. The client was interested in understanding, in general terms, what kind of valuation the parcel might attract if it were offered for sale or long-term lease. Could the Denver company provide a rough, informal estimate? The Denver company could. The Denver company did, after 2 weeks of internal review. The informal estimate came back at between $340 million and $410 million for outright purchase of the parcel and its mineral rights, or between $18 and $24 million per year for a long-term lease arrangement with extraction royalties on top. The Denver company expressed significant interest in being kept informed about the client's intentions. Francis, working through the same cutout, made a parallel inquiry to a smaller but well-regarded extraction firm based in Salt Lake City. The Salt Lake City firm came back 3 weeks later with an estimate of between $320 million and $380 million for outright purchase, with a proposed lease structure that was slightly less favorable than the Denver company's, but that included a higher upfront payment and a shorter term, which Francis noted on her legal pad as potentially interesting for certain strategic reasons. Delia had, by that point, moved out of the shed. Francis had made good on her promise in the last week of April. She had found, through a contact in the county seat, a small 2-bedroom rental in a village called Butler's Crossing, which was 17 miles from Mercer Hollow on a back road that almost nobody from town ever took. The rental was $900 a month. Francis had paid the first 3 months of rent personally, as an interest-bearing loan to Delia to be repaid out of any eventual recovery, a loan documented in a written agreement that Delia had signed after reading it twice. The rental was old and small and had linoleum floors in the kitchen and a faint smell of other people's cigarettes that would not quite come out of the walls. And to Delia, when she walked into it for the first time with Rosie beside her and set down the 2 garbage bags and the laundry basket that still constituted all of their worldly goods, it was the most beautiful place she had ever been. Rosie walked from room to room. She looked at the bathroom. She looked at the small kitchen. She looked at the bedroom that was going to be hers. She came back to her mother and she said, in a small, careful voice, "Mom, is this our house? We're renting it, baby. But yes, this is where we live now. Is it permanent?" Delia knelt down. She took her daughter by the shoulders. "Baby," she said, "I am going to be honest with you. A lot of things are going to change in the next year or two. Some of them are going to be hard to understand. But I want you to know, right now, that we are not going back to the shed. We are not going back to the car. We are not going to be evicted again. I promise you that. I promise you, Rosie. Do you hear me?" Rosie looked at her mother for a long moment. Then Rosie, who almost never cried, put her arms around Delia's neck and she cried, silently, into the collar of her mother's jacket for about a minute. Delia held her. She did not say anything. When Rosie stopped crying, she stepped back and wiped her face with her sleeve, and she said, "Can I pick which bedroom?" "Yes, sweetheart. You can pick." Rosie picked the smaller one, because it had a window that looked out onto a little patch of yard where a bird feeder had been left by a previous tenant, and Delia made up the bed with sheets Iris had given her, and she tucked Rosie in that night with the stuffed fox, and she sat on the edge of the bed and read her daughter a chapter of the library book about horses, and she thought this is what all of this is for. Everything I do for the next year is for this. In Mercer Hollow, meanwhile, the whispers had begun. Not the whispers about the lot. Not yet. The lot still looked like the lot. The disguise was still working. The whispers were about Delia. Specifically, the whispers were that Delia Grange, who had been evicted from her apartment in late March and who had been seen in early April carrying garbage bags through the gas station parking lot, had somehow, by the first week of May, moved into a place in Butler's Crossing and had started driving Rosie to school in a car that, while still the old Corolla, had been seen at the one-man mechanic shop off Route 9 having some kind of work done. The work was, in fact, minor, a single repair to the transmission mount that Francis had paid for out of pocket on the grounds that Delia being stranded on the side of a back road with Rosie in the car was not a risk Francis was willing to tolerate. But the mechanic's wife had mentioned it to her sister, and her sister had mentioned it to a friend. And by the middle of May, the Whisper Network in Mercer Hollow had taken up the question, how is Delia Grange paying for any of this? Harlan Pike was the first one to come looking for an answer. He found Delia at the laundromat on a Wednesday afternoon in late May. He came in. He nodded to Beverly, who watched him with a face that Beverly had been perfecting for 40 years as a laundromat owner, which was the face of a woman who missed absolutely nothing and admitted to absolutely nothing. And he walked up to the folding table where Delia was matching socks, and he leaned his elbows on the edge, and he smiled. Delia, I heard you got yourself set up. I got a job, Harlan. A job. Right. At the laundromat. That's right. 78 a week, Bev tells me. Delia did not look up from the socks. She did not correct him. The correct number was in fact 78, but she was impressed and slightly unsettled that Harlan had bothered to find out. A place in Butler's Crossing, I heard, Harlan said. That runs, what, $900 a month. That's my business, Harlan. Of course it is. Of course it is. He straightened up. He tapped his fingers on the table. I was just thinking. 78 a week times 4 is 312 a month. 900 minus 312 is a lot of room to make up. I was just thinking. A person in your situation, making ends meet on 312 a month in groceries, and a car and a kid. That's a lot of math. I'm managing. Are you? Delia looked up. She met his eyes for the first time. She did not know, in that moment, what was in her face, but whatever it was made Harlan blink once, involuntarily, and take half a step back from the folding table. I'm managing, Harlan, she said. Was there something else? No. Just checking in. On family. That's all. We're not really family. Well, in a manner of speaking. Not really, though. He smiled, a little tightly. I'll see you around, Delia. I expect you will. He left. Beverly, from behind the counter, did not say anything. Beverly did not need to. Delia finished folding the socks. She put them in the bin. She did not, outwardly, react in any way. Inwardly, she understood that something had shifted and that the shift was not insignificant. Harlan had come sniffing. Harlan was not a smart man, but Harlan had a certain kind of instinct, the instinct of a small-time predator who noticed, ahead of almost anyone else in town, when a wounded animal had unexpectedly stopped limping. He would not let it go. He would ask around. He would put together, eventually, the fact that Delia's small, unaccountable improvements in circumstances had started almost immediately after she refused his $400 offer for the lot. He would begin, at some point, to wonder about the lot itself. Delia called Francis that evening from the landline of the rental, which she had had installed the previous week on Francis's advice, so that she would no longer have to conduct important conversations from a pay phone on Main Street in full view of anyone who cared to notice. It's Harlan, Delia said. He's starting to ask questions. How much does he know? Nothing. He noticed the rental. He noticed the car repair. He thinks something doesn't add up. All right. This is within the expected range. Do not, under any circumstances, give him information. Do not confirm. Do not deny. Do not answer any questions about your finances. If he presses, tell him, and I am quoting now, I had a small windfall from my mother's estate that I have been saving for emergencies, and I am using it now. That sentence is technically true. It references an estate he has no way to verify, and it closes most lines of follow-up. Can you remember that sentence? A small windfall from my mother's estate that I have been saving for emergencies, and I am using it now. Good. Use it as needed. Use nothing else. He's not going to stop, Francis. I know he is not going to stop. We don't need him to stop. We need him to stay confused for another 6 to 8 months. Can I count on you to help him stay confused? Yes. Good. How is Rosie? She's good. She's good. She likes the house. Good. Go read her a book. I will call you on Sunday. Delia hung up the phone. She stood at the kitchen sink for a long time, looking out the small window over the bird feeder. The bird feeder was empty. Rosie had asked her that morning if they could get some birdseed. Delia had said yes. This weekend, we will get some birdseed. Small things. That was the trick. The whole year was going to be small things. Small lies to Harlan Pike. Small moves to make the car work. Small purchases, birdseed and school supplies, and a winter coat for Rosie that would actually fit this year instead of the too small one from last year that had been making Delia flinch every morning at the drop-off. Small, quiet, patient things. That was how you did this. That was how her grandfather had done it for 35 years. In early June, Frances flew to Denver. She met with the Lithium extraction company, face to face, in a private conference room on the 32nd floor of a building in the downtown business district. She did not, in that meeting, name Delia or the parcel. She negotiated, on behalf of an unnamed client, the general shape of what an eventual transaction might look like. She came back to Mercer Hollow on the 3rd of June with a preliminary term sheet that she laid out on Delia's kitchen table like the cards of a long, slow game of solitaire. "We have 3 structures to consider," Francis said. Option 1. Outright sale for $375 million, paid in 2 tranches over 18 months. Clean, fast, final. They walk away with the land. You walk away with the money. There is some tax complexity, but nothing I cannot handle. Option 2. 99-year lease at $21 million per year, escalating at 4% annually, with extraction royalties of 1.25% of gross on top. Over the life of the lease, this is worth several billion dollars on paper, although of course a significant portion of that is in future dollars. You retain ownership of the parcel. Your descendants retain ownership of the parcel. If the deposit turns out to be larger than current estimates, you share in the upside. Option 3. A hybrid. Partial sale of a majority mineral interest for $200 million upfront, plus an 8% carried interest in the extraction operation for 30 years, plus a buyback right in year 30. She looked at Delia across the table. Each of these is negotiable. Each of them has trade-offs. You do not need to decide tonight. You do not need to decide this month. What I want you to do, over the next few weeks, is think about what kind of life you want for yourself and for Rosie over the long term. Because the structure we choose will shape that life. Outright sale gives you cash, simplicity, and distance. Lease gives you income, complexity, and continued involvement. Hybrid gives you some of both. There is no wrong answer. There are answers that fit the kind of person you are, and answers that don't. Delia looked at the term sheet. She looked at the numbers. She thought about her grandfather, who had held on to the land for 41 years for reasons she was, only now, beginning to fully understand. She thought about the sentence in Dr. Ansell's 1974 report. Client is advised to retain ownership. She thought about the map behind the loose board in the shed, and about the stone on the windowsill, and about the fact that her grandfather had never spent a single dollar of what was under his own lot, because spending it had never been the point. Holding it had been the point. Holding it for someone who would come later. Holding it for her. "Francis," she said, "I don't think I want to sell it." Francis looked at her for a moment. Then, slowly, Francis smiled. It was the first time Delia had seen her smile, really smile, in all the weeks they had been working together, and it was a smile that Delia would remember for the rest of her life. "I thought you might say that," Francis said. "Is that crazy?" "No, honey, that is not crazy. That is, in my considered professional opinion, exactly the answer your grandfather would have given. Now, let's talk about how we structure a lease in a way that protects you and Rosie for the next 100 years. They talked until late that night. Rosie fell asleep on the couch in the living room, under the blanket Iris had brought over the week before, a hand-knit wool blanket that Iris had made herself and had been saving, she said, for the right occasion. When Delia finally closed the door behind Francis at 11 o'clock and stood in her small kitchen looking at the term sheet still spread across the table, she thought, for the first time in many months, about what her life was going to look like in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, and she found, to her own surprise, that she could almost begin to see it. In Mercer Hollow, meanwhile, Harlan Pike had begun making calls. He had called, by the second week of June, his cousin who worked at the county assessor's office. He had asked, in his casual, sideways way, whether there had been any recent filings related to the Grange parcel. The cousin had said there had not been. He had called his brother-in-law, who had a friend who worked for the title company in the county seat. He had asked whether there had been any title searches recently on the old Grange lot. The brother-in-law had called back 2 days later and said that, curiously, yes, there had been a title search, and not just one, but 2, both in the last 60 days, one from a law firm in Boise and one from something called a Nevada holding company. Harlan had filed this information away carefully. Harlan had not yet decided what to do with it. But Harlan was a patient man, in his own small way, and Harlan understood that when information started moving around a piece of property, the property itself was usually not far behind. On a Saturday in the middle of June, Harlan drove out to the lot. He parked his tow truck at the end of the gravel road. He got out. He walked across the gate that had been rusted open for 20 years, and he walked across the lot, through the knee-high grass, past the leaning shed, down to the lower quadrant where the water was still standing in shallow pools even in June, and he stood there for a long time. He did not know what he was looking for. He did not know why he had come. He only knew that something about the lot was different, in some way he could not name, and that the difference was the key to the whole mystery of Delia Grange's small, unaccountable, steady improvements in circumstance. He walked back to his truck. He drove back into town. He went to the diner on Main Street. He ordered coffee. He sat at the counter, and he watched the people come in and out, and he thought, something is going on with that lot. I do not know what it is, but I'm going to find out. That was the same Saturday that Delia, at her kitchen table in Butler's Crossing, was signing the first draft of a 99-year lease agreement that was going to pay her $21 million a year, indexed to inflation, for the rest of her life, and then pay her daughter $21 million a year, indexed to inflation, for the rest of her daughter's life, and then keep paying whoever came next. The draft was not final. The draft was going to go through 7 more revisions over the next 4 months. But the shape of it was set that Saturday afternoon, in a small rental kitchen 17 miles from Mercer Hollow, while Rosie sat on the floor coloring a picture of a horse, and while a gray river stone sat on the windowsill catching the afternoon light, and while a tow truck made its slow way back toward town, carrying inside it a man who was beginning, 6 months too late, to ask the right questions about the wrong woman. The summer went slow. That was the thing about a lease of the size and complexity Frances Delbridge was negotiating. It did not resolve in a month. It did not resolve in 2. It moved the way glaciers moved, the way her grandfather had once explained to her, long ago, that glaciers moved when she had asked him why the hills around Mercer Hollow looked the way they did. Slow, patient, inexorable, rearranging the landscape a quarter of an inch at a time, while the people on the surface of the land went about their days and did not notice anything was happening at all. Delia learned, through Frances's example, how to wait. She learned how to go to her job at the laundromat and fold other people's towels and make correct change and smile at Beverly and drive home to Butler's Crossing at the end of the day and help Rosie with her homework and read her a chapter of a book and go to bed at a reasonable hour. And all the while, in the background, in offices in Denver and Boise and Salt Lake City, paper was moving from one desk to another, and lawyers were marking up clauses in red pen, and the slow architecture of what was going to be the rest of Delia's life was being quietly constructed on her behalf by people she had mostly never met. Harlan Pike kept digging. That was the other constant of the summer. Harlan, having made his way out to the lot in June and having found nothing there to explain the mystery of Delia's small, steady improvements, had redirected his attention to the paperwork side. He had spent the first week of July at the county assessor's office, ostensibly researching an unrelated estate matter, but in fact pulling every file that bore the Grange name, every tax receipt, every survey notation, every marginal notation in the margins of old plat maps. He had found nothing useful. The disguise her grandfather had built was 40 years thick, and Harlan did not have the training to see through it. But he had noticed, and he had reported to anyone who would listen at the diner, that the old Grange parcel was, curiously, the subject of recent title searches from outside the state, and this detail, in a town the size of Mercer Hollow, moved through the population the way dime moved through water. By the end of July, Delia's mother's cousins had started calling. 2 of them, from out of state, people Delia had met perhaps twice in her life. They called separately, within 9 days of each other, which Frances found notable. They both opened with warm, concerned, recently rediscovered familial interest in Delia's well-being and Rosie's school performance. They both steered, within the first 6 minutes of each call, toward gentle questions about the old lot down by Copper Creek. They both used the same phrase, which Frances noted on her legal pad when Delia described the calls to her that Sunday. The phrase was family asset. They both referred to the lot as a family asset, in a tone that suggested they had been coached, or that they had coached each other, and they both inquired whether Delia might be interested in discussing a structured sharing arrangement that would, in one cousin's precise words, honor Grandpa Elias's memory by keeping things in the family. Delia had used Frances's prepared sentence on both of them. I had a small windfall from my mother's estate that I have been saving for emergencies, and I am using it now, she had added, to the second cousin, as a small improvisation of her own, that the lot was still a swamp as far as she knew and that she was not sure why anyone would be asking about it. Both cousins had gone away politely. Both cousins had called back, however, within 2 weeks. And by the end of August, a lawyer in Spokane had sent Delia a letter on behalf of those cousins, raising, in the careful generalized language of a lawyer who did not yet know whether he had a case, certain questions about the integrity of the 2010 probate proceedings through which Delia's mother had passed the lot to Delia, and expressing an interest in reviewing the original documents. Francis, reading the letter in Delia's kitchen, had looked up and said, very calmly, "All right. This is the part where it gets interesting. Are they going to be able to do anything?" "No. Your mother's probate was clean. I have reviewed it 3 times. There is no crack in it that any lawyer, however energetic, is going to pry open. This is a fishing letter. We are going to respond, by return mail, within 10 days, with a very polite, very thorough, very intimidating reply that closes off every avenue this lawyer might have been planning to explore, and that makes it clear to him that pursuing this matter further will be expensive for him and his clients and embarrassing for him professionally. I will draft it tonight. You will sign it tomorrow. That will, in 90% of cases like this, be the end of the correspondence." It was the end of the correspondence. The Spokane lawyer did not write back. The cousins did not call again. The lease signing happened on a Thursday in late September. It happened in a windowless conference room in Boise, on the 14th floor of an office building whose lobby had a granite floor and a security desk and a small brass plaque listing the names of the law firms and holding companies housed upstairs. Delia wore a navy blue dress that Iris had helped her pick out at a consignment store in the county seat. Rosie, who was back in school and who could not be there in person, had drawn her mother a good luck picture that Delia had folded carefully into her purse, a picture of a small girl and a horse standing in front of a very large, square, green building that Rosie had labeled Mom's office. The lease was 347 pages long. It had been negotiated across 5 months for separate drafts and 17 rounds of red line edits. It was structured as a 99-year lease to a specially formed subsidiary of the Denver mining concern, with a guaranteed floor payment of $22 million in year 1, indexed annually to inflation plus 2%, escalating over the life of the lease. It included an extraction royalty of 1 3/8% of gross proceeds, which Francis had negotiated up from the initial offer of 1 1/4. It included environmental restoration covenants that Delia had personally insisted on, which required the lessee to remediate the parcel to a specified ecological baseline at the conclusion of extraction activities, and which named the Mercer Hollow Public Library, Iris Halloway trustee, as the party authorized to inspect and enforce those covenants. It included a provision under which, in year 30 of the lease, Delia or her designated successor had the right to convert a portion of the royalty stream into equity in the lessee's operating entity. It included, at Delia's quiet request, a single-paragraph recital at the beginning that referenced the 1974 preliminary assessment by Drive Morton Ansell and described the parcel as a property retained by the Grange family across 3 generations for the specific purpose of responsible long-term stewardship. The recital had no legal force. It was there because Delia had wanted it there. Francis had not argued. Delia signed the lease with a black fountain pen that Francis had brought from Boise. The pen had belonged to Francis's mother, who had been a lawyer in the days when women lawyers had been rare, and Francis had used it for the signing of every significant contract in her 31-year career. She handed it to Delia with a small nod. Delia signed each of the 17 places that required her signature, and then she handed the pen back, and Francis capped it and put it back into its small leather case. And then Francis, without warning, stood up and walked around the conference table and put her arms around Delia's shoulders and held her there for a long moment. "Your grandfather," Francis said, quietly, "would be proud of you." "I hope so," Delia said. "He would be." They drove back to Mercer Hollow together that night, Francis at the wheel of her own car, Delia following in the Corolla, and they stopped at a diner halfway through the trip, and they ate cheeseburgers and French fries in a plastic booth under a flickering fluorescent light, and they did not say very much. There was not very much to say. The thing had been done. The slow glacier had reached its destination. The rest was going to be living. The first wire transfer landed in a newly established holding account on the following Monday. $22 million. Delia, standing in the kitchen in Butler's Crossing, looking at her laptop screen in the quiet of the morning after she had dropped Rosie at school, stared at the string of digits for a long time. The digits did not look any different than any other digits. They looked like the number Andrew Ansell had first spoken to her over the payphone 7 months earlier, and they looked like the number that had been sitting in her chest since then like a swallowed stone, and now the digits were hers, and they were real, and they did not feel, in that moment, like anything at all. They felt like weather. They felt like a fact of the world that had finally become the same as the fact it had always been in her own head. She closed the laptop. She made herself a cup of coffee. She sat at the kitchen table with the coffee, and she thought about her grandfather. She thought about the porch on Elm Street. She thought about the fishing reel and the rag. She thought about the way he had said, without looking up from his work, the ground keeps its own books. Then she got up. She washed the coffee cup. She drove to the laundromat. She worked her shift. Beverly asked her, toward the end of the shift, if everything was all right. Delia said yes, everything was all right. Beverly looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression that Beverly had, the expression of a woman who knew when she was being lied to in a way that did not require correction, and Beverly nodded and did not ask again. The secret broke on the 12th of October. It broke the way Francis had predicted it would break, which was through a routine filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission by the Denver Mining Concern, which was a publicly traded company and was therefore obligated to disclose material transactions in its quarterly reports. The report filed that October referenced, in the back half of its mineral acquisitions section, a 99-year lease of a 148-acre parcel in Mercer County, Idaho, projected initial annual payments of approximately $22 million, projected extraction yield of lithium carbonate equivalent at approximately 19,400 metric tons over the life of the lease. The report did not name Delia. The report did not name the lot. But the report was a public document, and a regional reporter for the Idaho Statesman, a young woman named Carla Moreno, caught it on the morning it posted, and she made 3 phone calls, and by the afternoon she had figured out which parcel in Mercer County the report referred to, and by 5 o'clock that evening she had driven the 97 miles from Boise to Mercer Hollow and had parked her car in the lot of the Mercer Hollow Public Library, where she found Iris Halloway closing up for the day, and where Iris, having been warned by Francis that precisely this moment was going to arrive, politely but firmly directed her to Francis Delbridge's office in Boise, and closed the library door behind her without saying another word. The story ran the next morning. It ran on the front page of the regional section of the Idaho Statesman and was picked up, within 8 hours, by the Associated Press, and within 24 hours the story had appeared, in one form or another, in newspapers and news sites in 41 states. The story did not name Delia. Delia's name had been protected by the Nevada holding company structure, which had done exactly what Francis had designed it to do, which was to add enough layers of corporate opacity between Delia and the parcel that no reporter working on a 2-day deadline was going to be able to trace through all of them. What the story did name was the town. Mercer Hollow, Idaho. A flooded acre-and-a-half lot. A 9-figure lease. A lithium deposit that had gone unnoticed for 50 years underground that the entire region had written off as worthless. That was the day the town found out. Delia did not drive into town that day. Francis had advised against it. Delia stayed at the rental in Butler's Crossing, and she kept Rosie home from school on the pretext of a mild cold, and she did not answer her phone. Her phone rang 64 times between 9 in the morning and noon. She let it go to voicemail. At 12:30, she unplugged the landline. At 1 o'clock, she made lunch for Rosie, grilled cheese and tomato soup, and they ate it at the kitchen table with the radio off, and Delia watched her daughter eat and thought, "This is the last normal lunch we are going to have for a while. Enjoy it." By 2 o'clock, the first car was in the driveway. It was not Harlan. It was a cousin, one of the same cousins whose lawyer Francis had sent away in August. She had driven down from Spokane on no sleep. She had her daughter in the car. She stood on Delia's porch, and she knocked, and she called through the door, her voice working up and down the register between a calculated sweetness and something thinner and sharper underneath, and Delia sat at the kitchen table with Rosie and did not move, and eventually, after maybe 40 minutes, the cousin left. She left a card. She left a handwritten note. She left an envelope containing, absurdly, a photograph of Delia's mother as a girl, dug up from somewhere as evidence of family closeness. Delia collected all of it after the cousin's car had disappeared and put it in a shoebox in the hall closet, where she would, over the following weeks, collect a great many other similar artifacts from a great many other suddenly close relatives, and she closed the closet door. By the end of the week, the town had produced its full response. Delia, at Francis's advice, continued to stay in Butler's Crossing. She stopped working at the laundromat because the laundromat had become, by Wednesday afternoon, a small informal gathering place for people hoping to glimpse her, and because Beverly, in her usual sideways way, had called Delia on Tuesday night and said only, "Honey, I love you, but I think we are going to have to put the job on pause for a while, for both our sakes." And Delia had understood, and had agreed, and had thanked her, and had promised that she would come back and visit soon in a quieter capacity. She did not go to the diner. She did not go to the gas station. She did not go to the grocery store. Francis had arranged a delivery service out of the county seat. Iris came to the rental 3 times a week, bringing mail and news and the occasional casserole and the quiet, steady presence that had been the one reliable thing in Delia's life for most of the last year. Iris reported, in small patient increments, what the town was saying. The town was saying a great many things. Some of them were kind. Most of them were not. A few of them were ugly in the specific ways that towns got ugly when a person they had previously been comfortable pitying turned out, overnight, to be someone they were going to have to reclassify. A letter to the editor in the Mercer Hollow Weekly argued, in language that was technically careful but substantively hostile, that any mineral wealth discovered in the county ought to belong to the county, and that individual lucky heirs should not be permitted to profit privately from what was in some deep sense a shared regional resource. The letter was signed by 4 people. One of the signatories was Delia's old high school principal, a man she had not thought about in 15 years. Delia read the letter in the kitchen on a Saturday morning. She read it twice. Then she folded it up and she put it in the shoebox with the other artifacts. And she made pancakes for Rosie, and they ate them together while Rosie told her about a book she was reading and about a girl at school who had started wearing purple shoes, and Delia listened to every word, and she did not think about the letter again until much later. Harlan Pike appeared on the 14th day. He came to the rental in the afternoon, on a Tuesday, alone. He parked his tow truck at the end of the driveway, and he walked up to the porch with his cap in his hands, and he stood at the door, and he knocked, and Delia, watching through the kitchen window, let him stand there for nearly 2 minutes before she walked to the door and opened it. He looked older than he had at the laundromat. He looked smaller. He looked, Delia thought, with a small surprise at her own reaction, tired. "Delia," he said. "Harlan, I'm not here to ask for anything. Okay. I wanted to come and say my piece. In person. Because I figured I owed you that." "All right." He looked at his cap. He turned it in his hands. "I offered you $400 for that lot in March. I knew what I was doing. I knew you were desperate. I was trying to take advantage of a woman who had a kid to feed and no other options. That's what I was doing. I've done that kind of thing most of my life, Delia. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I've made a living off of other people's bad moments. And most of the time I figure, well, they needed the money, and I needed the money, and we both made a trade, and that's how it works. But that's a lie I tell myself. It was a lie then, and it's a lie now. I was trying to cheat you. I want to say it out loud because it's true, and because you and your grandpa didn't deserve it." Delia did not say anything. She held the door. "I'm not asking for anything," Harlan said again. "I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to hear me say it, in my own words, in person, before I die, because I figure I'm going to die one of these years, and if I don't say it to you now, I won't ever have said it to anybody." The story ran the next morning. It ran on the front page of the regional section of the Idaho Statesman and was picked up, within 8 hours, by the Associated Press, and within 24 hours the story had appeared, in one form or another, in newspapers and news sites in 41 states. The story did not name Delia. Delia's name had been protected by the Nevada holding company structure, which had done exactly what Francis had designed it to do, which was to add enough layers of corporate opacity between Delia and the parcel that no reporter working on a 2-day deadline was going to be able to trace through all of them. What the story did name was the town. Mercer Hollow, Idaho. A flooded acre-and-a-half lot. A 9-figure lease. a lithium deposit that had gone unnoticed for 50 years underground that the entire region had written off as worthless. That was the day the town found out. Delia did not drive into town that day. Francis had advised against it. Delia stayed at the rental in Butler's Crossing, and she kept Rosie home from school on the pretext of a mild cold, and she did not answer her phone. Her phone rang 64 times between 9 in the morning and noon. She let it go to voicemail. At 12:30, she unplugged the landline. At 1 o'clock, she made lunch for Rosie, grilled cheese and tomato soup, and they ate it at the kitchen table with the radio off, and Delia watched her daughter eat and thought, "This is the last normal lunch we are going to have for a while. Enjoy it." By 2 o'clock, the first car was in the driveway. It was not Harlan. It was a cousin, one of the same cousins whose lawyer Francis had sent away in August. She had driven down from Spokane on no sleep. She had her daughter in the car. She stood on Delia's porch, and she knocked, and she called through the door, her voice working up and down the register between a calculated sweetness and something thinner and sharper underneath, and Delia sat at the kitchen table with Rosie and did not move, and eventually, after maybe 40 minutes, the cousin left. She left a card. She left a handwritten note. She left an envelope containing, absurdly, a photograph of Delia's mother as a girl, dug up from somewhere as evidence of family closeness. Delia collected all of it after the cousin's car had disappeared and put it in a shoebox in the hall closet, where she would, over the following weeks, collect a great many other similar artifacts from a great many other suddenly close relatives, and she closed the closet door. By the end of the week, the town had produced its full response. Delia, at Francis's advice, continued to stay in Butler's Crossing. She stopped working at the laundromat because the laundromat had become, by Wednesday afternoon, a small informal gathering place for people hoping to glimpse her, and because Beverly, in her usual sideways way, had called Delia on Tuesday night and said only, "Honey, I love you, but I think we are going to have to put the job on pause for a while, for both our sakes." And Delia had understood, and had agreed, and had thanked her, and had promised that she would come back and visit soon in a quieter capacity. She did not go to the diner. She did not go to the gas station. She did not go to the grocery store. Francis had arranged a delivery service out of the county seat. Iris came to the rental 3 times a week, bringing mail and news and the occasional casserole and the quiet, steady presence that had been the one reliable thing in Delia's life for most of the last year. Iris reported, in small patient increments, what the town was saying. The town was saying a great many things. Some of them were kind. Most of them were not. A few of them were ugly in the specific ways that towns got ugly when a person they had previously been comfortable pitying turned out, overnight, to be someone they were going to have to reclassify. A letter to the editor in the Mercer Hollow Weekly argued, in language that was technically careful but substantively hostile, that any mineral wealth discovered in the county ought to belong to the county, and that individual lucky heirs should not be permitted to profit privately from what was in some deep sense a shared regional resource. The letter was signed by 4 people. One of the signatories was Delia's old high school principal, a man she had not thought about in 15 years. Delia read the letter in the kitchen on a Saturday morning. She read it twice. Then she folded it up and she put it in the shoebox with the other artifacts, and she made pancakes for Rosie, and they ate them together while Rosie told her about a book she was reading and about a girl at school who had started wearing purple shoes, and Delia listened to every word, and she did not think about the letter again until much later. Harlan Pike appeared on the 14th day. He came to the rental in the afternoon, on a Tuesday, alone. He parked his tow truck at the end of the driveway, and he walked up to the porch with his cap in his hands, and he stood at the door, and he knocked, and Delia, watching through the kitchen window, let him stand there for nearly 2 minutes before she walked to the door and opened it. He looked older than he had at the laundromat. He looked smaller. He looked, Delia thought, with a small surprise at her own reaction, tired. "Delia," he said. "Harlan, I'm not here to ask for anything. Okay. I wanted to come and say my piece. In person. Because I figured I owed you that." "All right." He looked at his cap. He turned it in his hands. "I offered you $400 for that lot in March. I knew what I was doing. I knew you were desperate. I was trying to take advantage of a woman who had a kid to feed and no other options. That's what I was doing. I've done that kind of thing most of my life, Delia. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I've made a living off of other people's bad moments. And most of the time I figure, Well, they needed the money, and I needed the money, and we both made a trade, and that's how it works. But that's a lie, I tell myself. It was a lie then, and it's a lie now. I was trying to cheat you. I want to say it out loud because it's true, and because you and your grandpa didn't deserve it. Delia did not say anything. She held the door. I'm not asking for anything, Harlan said again. I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to hear me say it, in my own words, in person, before I die, because I figure I'm going to die one of these years, and if I don't say it to you now, I won't ever have said it to anybody. She worked for Delia for the next 11 years. She built the foundation into something that, by the end of her tenure, was helping roughly 2,000 rural families a year across 4 states. Delia, for her part, stayed in the background. She chaired the board. She read every grant proposal personally for the first 4 years, and she continued to read a selection of them for every year after that. She drove, in the first year, to meet some of the first grant recipients in person, a practice Nellie gently discouraged after the first 6 visits, on the grounds that it was more emotionally sustainable for Delia to maintain some distance from the individual cases, but that Delia resumed, in her own quieter way, by reading the annual report cover to cover every January and writing a personal note, in her own handwriting, to one randomly selected recipient family each year on the anniversary of the day she had found the map behind the loose board in the shed. The lot itself became, in the years that followed, a small, strange, quiet, working landscape. The lithium extraction operation began in the 4th year of the lease. It was subterranean, mostly. It did not, from the gravel road, look like very much. There was a modest pump house, painted dark green, and a small access road that had been paved with a kind of permeable gravel that did not disturb the water flow, and a series of discrete monitoring stations that measured the health of the local water table on a quarterly basis and that reported, publicly, every one of their readings. The cattails still grew. The water still stood in the low places in the spring. The fallen cottonwood was eventually removed, because it had begun to pose a minor hazard during high water, but a new cottonwood had been planted, at Delia's request, in almost exactly the same spot, and by the 15th year of the lease the new cottonwood was nearly as tall as the old one had been. The shed stayed. That was a thing Delia had insisted on in the lease. The shed did not have to be removed, and the extraction operation could not, under any circumstance, demolish it. The shed was repainted once, in year 6, by a small local contractor, and had its roof replaced in year 11, but otherwise it stood through the whole 99-year lease, small and leaning and visibly imperfect, and Delia, when she drove past the lot 3 or 4 times a year in the early period, and then once or twice a year as she got older, would sometimes stop and walk out to the shed and stand inside it for a few minutes and touch the loose board on the inner wall, which was no longer loose, because she had, in year 2, taken it home and had mounted it in a small wooden frame that she kept on the wall of her office in Butler's Crossing, and behind it she had installed a new, plain board that did not hide anything and did not need to. Rosie grew. That was, in the end, the whole point of everything, and it was also the thing that Delia spent the most time thinking about, in the quiet evenings, in the years that followed. Rosie grew up in the little house in Butler's Crossing with its added porch and its small office where her mother worked, and she went to the same school in Mercer Hollow all the way through, riding the school bus in the morning and in the afternoon, carrying a normal backpack, eating a normal lunch, being, to her classmates and to her teachers and to the other parents she encountered at school events, the perfectly ordinary daughter of a single mother who worked in nonprofit administration. The wealth was, in Rosie's everyday life, almost invisible. Delia had been careful about this, with Francis's guidance and with the foundation's board support. Rosie had chores. Rosie had an allowance of $6 a week until she was 12 and $10 a week thereafter, and she had to earn it by doing the dishes and taking out the recycling. Rosie had birthday parties that were held at home with a reasonable number of friends and a reasonable number of presents and a cake that Delia had, for most of Rosie's childhood, baked herself, because baking a cake was one of the things Delia had discovered, in the years after the lot, that she enjoyed and was good at and wanted to keep doing. When Rosie turned 18, Delia sat her down at the kitchen table and explained, in detail, the trust structure that had been set up for her benefit. She explained the lease, the royalties, the foundation, and the careful mechanism by which Rosie would, beginning on her 30th birthday, receive a monthly income from a trust that would, by any reasonable measure, ensure that Rosie would never have to worry about money again for the rest of her life. But that would not, by its specific design, ever deliver to her an amount so large in any single year that it would be likely to distort her decisions about what to do with her life. She explained the philosophy behind the structure, which was the philosophy her grandfather had followed and that she had come to understand, only in retrospect, was the single wisest thing anyone had ever taught her. She explained that money was a tool, and that its only value lay in what you used it for, and that people who had too much of it too quickly almost always used it badly, and that the trust had been designed, carefully and with love, to prevent Rosie from ever being in that position. Rosie listened to all of it. Rosie was 18. She had grown up into a tall, quiet, serious young woman with her mother's steadiness and her grandfather's small, private smile, which Delia could still, sometimes, see on Rosie's face during particular moments, and which always, still, after all these years, made Delia's throat close up for a second. When Delia was finished talking, Rosie was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Mom." "Yeah, baby. Do you remember when we lived in the shed?" "Of course. Do you remember, the first morning, when we woke up in the shed, and you made oatmeal, and I asked if we were camping, and you said we were camping for a little while, and it was going to be an adventure?" "I remember. I knew we weren't camping." Delia looked at her daughter across the kitchen table. "I figured you did. I knew it the whole time. I knew what was going on. I wasn't stupid. But I pretended, because I could tell you needed me to pretend, and because I loved you, and because I figured if my mom was going to keep going, then I was going to keep going too. Rosie, I just want you to know, because I don't think I've ever told you. That whole year, from the time Mr. Harvey put the notice on the door, all of it, I knew you were scared. I could feel it. I knew we were in trouble. And I knew, the whole time, that you were going to figure it out, because you're you. I didn't know about the lot. I didn't know what was under it. But I knew you were going to figure something out, because you always figured things out. And you did. You figured it out." Delia did not say anything for a long moment. She reached across the kitchen table. She put her hand on top of Rosie's hand. "I couldn't have done it without you, baby," she said. "I want you to know that. I could not have gotten through any of it without you. You were the whole reason." "I know, Mom." Okay. They sat at the kitchen table for a while after that. They did not say anything else. They did not need to. Rosie went to college on the coast that fall. She studied environmental science, which Delia had not expected, but which Delia, upon reflection, found to be exactly the right choice. Rosie came home every Christmas and every summer. She graduated in 4 years. She took a job, upon graduation, with a small hydrological research firm in Oregon, a job that paid a modest, reasonable salary, and she lived in a small apartment, and she ate out one night a week, and she did her own laundry, and her monthly income from the trust, which began on her 30th birthday, arrived every first of the month in the same amount, and it went, almost entirely, into a savings account that she did not touch, because she did not, as it turned out, need it. Rosie had been raised to make her own living. Rosie was going to keep making her own living, on her own terms, until the day she decided otherwise. That was, Delia thought, the best outcome she could have imagined. Iris died in Delia's 24th year of the lease. She was 87. She died in her sleep, peacefully, in the little cottage she had lived in for 50 years, with the cat on the bed beside her and the reading glasses folded on the nightstand. Delia paid for the funeral. Delia delivered a short eulogy at the Presbyterian church in Mercer Hollow, which was the first time in 20 years she had been back to that church, and which was the largest public event she had attended in all that time. She spoke about Iris's kindness and Iris's patience and Iris's quiet, steady, unshakable refusal to give up on people even when the rest of the world had written them off. She did not mention the lot. She did not mention the money. She did not need to. Everyone in the church knew. Everyone in the church had known for years. Iris herself had known, and had understood, and had never, in all the years after the secret broke, treated Delia one bit differently than she had treated her when Delia had walked into the library on that Saturday afternoon looking for a retired geologist named Dr. Ansell. Delia established a scholarship in Iris's name through the foundation. The scholarship paid the full cost of library science degrees at any accredited program in the country for students from rural counties in Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and Montana. The scholarship had, by the time of Delia's own eventual passing many years later, produced over 300 rural librarians. Some of them, Delia sometimes thought, would go on to help someone the way Iris had helped her. Some of them would not. That was all right. The scholarship was not a transaction. It was a tribute. Iris had understood the difference. In the 40th year of the lease, Delia was 69 years old. She was walking a little more slowly than she had. Rosie had, by then, 2 children of her own, a boy and a girl, both of them old enough to understand some of the family history and young enough to still think their grandmother was, despite her small, quiet life in the house in Butler's Crossing, the most interesting person they knew. The older of the two, the girl, whose name was Eliza, had started asking questions about the old family lot down by Copper Creek. Delia took her to see it, on a clear afternoon in the middle of April. They drove out in Delia's car, which was by then a 10-year-old sedan that Delia had bought used and had never seen any reason to replace. They parked at the end of the gravel road. The gate that had been rusted open since before Delia had been born was still rusted open. The pump house, painted dark green, was visible at the far end of the lot, tasteful and quiet in the distance. The cattails were coming up in the spring water. A few early blackbirds sat on the fence line. The new cottonwood, which was no longer new, stood tall and full against the ridge. The shed was still there, painted, re-roofed, straightened, but still there. "This is it," Delia said. Eliza, who was 11 years old and who had heard the story most of her life, but who had never seen the actual place, stood for a long time and looked. Then she said, "It's smaller than I thought. Most important places are. Grandma, is it true what Mom said, that you lived here?" "For a little while. Yes. With her. With her. In that shed. In that shed." Eliza was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Grandma, I don't think I would have been brave enough." Delia put her hand on the back of her granddaughter's head. She thought, for a long moment, about what to say. "Eliza," she said finally, "I want you to listen to me, because this is one of the most important things I am ever going to tell you, and I want you to remember it. I was not brave. I was not special. I did not have any courage that you don't have. I was just a person in a hard spot who had to keep putting one foot in front of the other, because that was the only thing there was to do. That is all anybody ever is, in the hard moments. Just a person putting one foot in front of the other. You are going to have hard moments too, eventually. Everybody does. And when you do, I want you to remember that you are not going to need to be brave. You are going to need to just keep putting one foot in front of the other. And you will be able to, because that is what people do, and because you come from a long line of people who did. And that is all." Eliza looked up at her grandmother. "Okay," she said. "Okay." They stood in the afternoon sun. The cattails moved a little in the light wind. Somewhere down in the lower quadrant, underneath the standing water, underneath the lake bed, underneath the whole patient, quiet history of the ground, the ledger her grandfather had once told her about kept right on keeping itself. The ground knew. The ground had always known. And the ground, in the end, had given up what it had been holding to the only person it had been willing to give it up to, which was a woman who had come out to it with $4 and a sleeping child on a rainy Tuesday in March, because she had run out of every other place to go, and who had proven, by refusing $400 from the first person who tried to take it from her, that she was, exactly as her grandfather had hoped, the right person to find it. Delia took her granddaughter's hand. They walked back to the car. They drove home slowly, through the long light of the late afternoon, past the gas station and the library and the diner and the school, and Delia, at the wheel, thought about her grandfather, and about Iris, and about Francis, and about Andrew Ansell, and about Dr. Halvorson, and about Beverly, and about Mrs. Harper, and about all the many ordinary people who had, in small ways and large, reached out a hand to her when she had most needed one. And she thought about how the only real way to pay any of them back was to keep reaching out, in her turn, to the next person who needed one. And she thought that she had, in the long, slow way these things had to be done, managed to do that, and that she was going to keep doing it for whatever number of years she had left. The ground kept its own books, but the people kept their own books too. And in both books, if you were lucky, and if you were patient, and if you kept your hands open, the ledger eventually balanced. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.